Hello, everyone. Tonight, I want to help you let go of the day and ease into rest. I know many of you use these videos to fall asleep, and it means a lot to be part of your nightly routine. So, if you haven't already, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. It truly helps. Now, close your eyes and let's begin. Story 1. The Phantom CB. Our first story comes from Jake Morrison, a 23-year veteran of the road, who's hauled everything from produce to heavy machinery across all 48 contiguous states. Jake contacted me last month with a story that's been eating at him for over 5 years now. Here's what he told me, in his own words. I've been driving trucks since I was 19 years old, and I thought I'd seen everything there was to see on the road. I've driven through blizzards that would make a polar bear shiver, navigated mountain passes in fog so thick you couldn't see your own hood, and I've shared the highway with every kind of crazy driver you can imagine. But nothing, and I mean nothing, prepared me for what happened to me on Interstate 80 in Nevada back in the winter of 2019. I was hauling a load of electronics from California to Chicago, running behind schedule due to some delays at the warehouse. It was about 2:30 in the morning, and I was pushing through that long, empty stretch of I-80 between Reno and Salt Lake City. You know the one, where there's nothing but sagebrush and darkness for miles in every direction. The weather was clear, no traffic to speak of, just me and the endless ribbon of asphalt stretching out ahead of my headlights. I had my CB on Channel 19, listening to the usual late-night chatter, drivers warning about speed traps, weather conditions, that sort of thing. The conversation was light, mostly guys trying to stay awake on the long haul. That's when I first heard him. The voice came through crystal clear, clearer than any CB transmission I'd ever heard. No static, no distortion, just this calm, measured voice that seemed to cut through the normal radio chatter like a knife. "Eastbound driver in the Peterbilt," the voice said. "You need to slow down." I looked around, confused. I was doing about 75 in a 70 zone, nothing crazy. Plus, how did this guy know what kind of truck I was driving? It was dark, and I hadn't seen another vehicle for at least 20 miles. "Breaker 19, I responded. "This is the Eastbound Pete. Who am I talking to?" "Someone who's trying to help you," came the reply. "There's danger ahead. You need to slow down to 50 and stay in the right lane." Now, I've been on the road long enough to know that truckers look out for each other. If someone's warning you about something, you listen. Could be a speed trap, could be construction, could be an accident. So I eased off the throttle and brought my speed down to 50. "What kind of danger are we talking about?" I asked into the CB. Silence. I tried again. "Breaker for the driver who just gave me the heads up. What's the situation ahead?" Nothing but static. I figured maybe the guy had moved out of range, or maybe his radio had gone dead. These things happen. But I kept my speed down and stayed alert, scanning the road ahead for whatever he'd been warning me about. About 10 minutes later, I came around a long curve and saw them, flashing lights everywhere. There had been a massive pileup involving at least 6 vehicles, including 2 semis. Emergency crews were still working the scene, and traffic was being funneled into a single lane. If I'd been doing 75 when I came around that curve, I might not have been able to stop in time. I grabbed my CB mic. "Breaker for whoever warned me about the accident ahead. You probably saved my life, buddy. Thank you." "You're welcome," came that same clear voice. "Drive safe." I should have left it at that, but something about the whole situation was bugging me. How had this guy known about my truck? How had he known about the accident before I could see any sign of it? And why was his transmission so crystal clear when everyone else's had the usual static and distortion? "Hey, driver," I called out. "What's your 20? I'd like to buy you a cup of coffee at the next truck stop." "That won't be necessary," he replied. "Just keep driving safe." "Come on," I pressed. "Where are you? I don't see any other trucks around here." Long pause. Then, "I'm in the truck that went off the bridge 3 years ago." The blood in my veins turned to ice water. "What did you say?" But there was no response. I kept trying to raise him on the radio, but got nothing but static. When I finally made it to the next truck stop, I asked around about any bridge accidents in the area. The night clerk, an old-timer who'd been working there for decades, told me about a driver who'd lost control in a snowstorm 3 years earlier, went right through the guardrail on a bridge about 30 miles back and dropped 200 feet into a canyon. "Never found the body," he said. "Truck was too mangled, and the canyon's too deep and dangerous to mount a proper recovery operation." I asked what kind of truck it was. "Peterbilt," he said. "Same as yours." I never heard that voice on the radio again, but I'll never forget it either. Clear as day, calm as anything, warning me about danger ahead. Sometimes I wonder if that driver is still out there, still trying to look out for the rest of us. But I try not to think about it too much. Some things are better left alone. Jake's story is just the beginning of tonight's journey into the unknown. Our next tale comes from the desert highways of Arizona, where the heat plays tricks on your mind, and sometimes those tricks turn deadly. Story 2. The Heat Mirage. Sarah Chen has been driving long haul for 8 years, specializing in cross-country runs that take her through some of America's most challenging terrain. She's a careful driver, methodical and professional, which makes her experience on Arizona State Route 95 all the more unsettling. Sarah reached out to me through our website, and when we spoke on the phone, I could hear the confusion and fear still lingering in her voice, even though her encounter happened over a year ago. Here's her story. "I've always prided myself on being a rational person. I believe in what I can see, touch, and verify. Ghost stories and supernatural nonsense never held any appeal for me. I'm a truck driver, not a storyteller. I deal in facts, schedules, and getting from point A to point B safely and on time. But what happened to me on Route 95 in Arizona last summer has shaken that rational worldview to its core. I was hauling a load of construction equipment from Los Angeles to Phoenix, running the night shift to avoid the brutal daytime heat. Even at 3 in the morning, the temperature outside was still pushing 90 degrees. The air conditioning in my cab was working overtime, and I was grateful for every degree of cool air it could manage. Route 95 through that part of Arizona is about as desolate as it gets. Miles and miles of desert scrub, rocky hills, and absolutely nothing else. No towns, no gas stations, no signs of human habitation for hours at a stretch. During the day, you might see heat mirages shimmering on the asphalt. At night, it's just darkness, punctuated by your headlights and the occasional reflection of animal eyes. I was about 2 hours into my shift when I first saw the lights. They appeared suddenly in my mirrors, 2 bright headlights gaining on me fast, too fast. I was doing about 70, and whoever this was had to be pushing 100 to close the distance that quickly. "Idiot," I muttered to myself, moving slightly to the right to give the speed demon plenty of room to pass. We get all kinds on the highways. People who think the speed limit is just a suggestion, especially on these empty desert roads. But the lights didn't pass. They pulled up right behind me and just ... stayed there. Close, uncomfortably close. I could see them clearly in my side mirrors, two brilliant white orbs that seemed almost too bright, too intense. I eased off the throttle a bit, giving them even more room to pass, but they matched my speed exactly. When I sped up, they sped up. When I slowed down, they slowed down. It was like they were tethered to my trailer. This went on for about 10 miles, and I was starting to get annoyed. I've dealt with road rage incidents before. Drivers who get offended if you're in their way, or who just want to mess with truckers for the hell of it. I reached for my CB to see if I could raise the driver behind me. Breaker 19 for the four-wheeler on my back door. I called out, "You need to pass or back off, buddy. You're way too close." No response. I tried again, this time with a bit more edge in my voice. "Vehicle following the eastbound semi on 95, you need to maintain a safe following distance or go around." Still nothing. I decided to take a closer look at what I was dealing with, so I adjusted my mirrors to get a better view. What I saw made absolutely no sense. The headlights were there, clear as day, bright and steady, but I couldn't make out any vehicle around them. No outline of a car, no truck, no motorcycle, just two floating orbs of light keeping perfect pace with my rig. I blinked hard, rubbed my eyes, looked again, same thing, just the lights. "This is impossible," I said out loud, my voice sounding strange in the quiet cab. I decided to test whatever this thing was. I hit my brakes, not hard enough to cause an accident, but enough to force any normal vehicle to react. The lights immediately matched my deceleration, maintaining that same uncomfortably close distance. Then I tried something else. I put on my turn signal and started to change lanes, moving from the right lane to the left. The lights followed, staying directly behind me, like they were magnetically attached to my trailer. My heart was pounding now. This wasn't road rage. This wasn't some drunk driver playing games. This was something else entirely. I reached for my phone to call 911, but realized how crazy I would sound. "Hello, officer. I'd like to report two headlights with no car attached following my truck. They'd think I was having heat stroke or hallucinations." The lights stayed with me for another 20 miles, through curves and straightaways, up hills and down into valleys. Perfect synchronization, never varying the distance, never trying to pass, just ... following. Then, as suddenly as they'd appeared, they were gone. I was watching them in my mirror 1 second, and the next second there was nothing but empty highway behind me. No fade out, no gradual disappearance, just there one moment, gone the next. I pulled over at the first truck stop I found, about 40 miles down the road. My hands were shaking as I climbed out of the cab and walked around my truck, checking for any damage, any sign of what had just happened. Everything looked normal. Inside the truck stop, I asked the night clerk if he'd heard of anything like this happening before. He was a young guy, maybe early 20s, and he just shrugged. "Desert plays tricks on people," he said. "Heat, mirages, reflections, that sort of thing." It was 3 in the morning, I told him. No heat, no mirages. He shrugged again and went back to his magazine. But as I was leaving, an older trucker who'd been sitting at the coffee counter got up and followed me outside. "You saw them too, didn't you?" he said quietly. Saw what? The lights. Following you on 95. I stopped dead in my tracks. You know about this. He nodded grimly. Happened to me about 6 months ago. Same stretch of road, same time of night. 2 lights, no vehicle, following 4 miles, and then just ... gone. What do you think it was? He lit a cigarette and stared out at the desert. There was a bad accident on that stretch about 10 years ago. Family in a sedan, coming back from Vegas. Drunk driver hit them head up. Whole family killed. Parents, 2 kids. What does that have to do with the drunk driver was in a semi? He continued. Fell asleep at the wheel, crossed the center line, killed himself too. I felt a chill run down my spine despite the heat. Some of us think, well, maybe those lights are keeping an eye on trucks running that stretch, making sure we stay alert, stay safe. That's impossible. He took a long drag on his cigarette. Is it? You tell me what else could explain to headlights with no car attached. I couldn't. I still can't. I've driven that route 6 more times since then. Always at night, always nervous. But I haven't seen the lights again. Maybe they only appear when they need to. Maybe they're watching out for drivers who are getting too comfortable, too complacent. Or maybe I'm losing my mind. But that trucker at the rest stop, ... he saw them too. And from the look in his eyes, I don't think he was the only one. Story 3. The Thing in the Woods. Mark Rodriguez has been a long-haul trucker for 15 years, but he's considering a career change after what happened to him last October on Highway 26 in Oregon. Mark's story is one of the most disturbing accounts I've received, made all the more unsettling by his obvious reluctance to share it. When Mark first contacted me, he said he wasn't sure he should tell anyone about what he'd experienced. He'd kept it to himself for months, but the memory was eating at him. He needed to get it off his chest, needed to know if anyone else had seen what he'd seen in those dark Oregon woods. Here's Mark's story, exactly as he told it to me. I'm not a superstitious man. I wasn't raised that way. My dad was a mechanic. My mom was a nurse, and they taught me to trust in what I could see and touch and understand. The supernatural, the paranormal, all of that. It was just stories people told to scare each other around campfires. I wish I still believed that. Last October, I was hauling a load of lumber from Portland to Denver. It was a routine run, one I'd done dozens of times before. The weather was typical for Oregon in the fall, cold, wet, with a steady drizzle that made the roads slick and visibility poor. I was about 3 hours into my shift, somewhere on Highway 26 between Government Camp and Madras, when my engine started acting up. The temperature gauge began climbing, and I could hear the engine strain in a way that told me I needed to pull over before I blew something expensive. This part of 26 runs through dense forest, thick stands of Douglas fir and pine that block out most of the light even during the day. At night, with rain falling and no moon visible through the clouds, it was like driving through a tunnel of absolute darkness. I found a wide spot on the shoulder and pulled over, hazard lights flashing, grabbed my flashlight and rain gear and climbed out to check under the hood. The problem was immediately obvious. A burst radiator hose had sprayed coolant all over the engine compartment. It was fixable, but I'd need to let the engine cool down first, and I didn't have a spare hose. I was looking at calling for roadside assistance and probably spending the night right there. I climbed back into the cab and reached for my cell phone, but of course there was no signal. These mountain roads are notorious for dead zones. I tried my CB radio, but couldn't raise anyone. Too much interference from the terrain. So I settled in to wait for another driver to come by who could either help me out or relay a message to the nearest truck stop. That's when I first heard it, a sound from the woods. At first, I thought it might be an animal, maybe a deer or an elk moving through the underbrush. But the more I listened, the more wrong it sounded. It was rhythmic, like footsteps, but too slow and deliberate to be natural and heavy. Whatever was making that sound was big. I rolled down my window slightly and listened more carefully. The sound was coming from the woods on the driver's side of the truck, maybe 30 or 40 feet back from the road. Steady, measured steps crunching through fallen leaves and snapping small branches. Then it stopped. Complete silence, except for the rain pattering on my roof and the tick-tick-tick of my cooling engine. I waited, listening. Minutes passed. Just when I was starting to think the animal had moved on, I heard something that made my blood run cold. A voice, not words, exactly, but vocalizations. Low, guttural sounds that rose and fell, like someone trying to speak, but not quite managing it. Like someone with a severely damaged throat, attempting to form syllables. The sounds were coming from the same area where I'd heard the footsteps. I grabbed my flashlight and aimed the beam toward the woods, but the trees were too thick. All I could see was rain falling through the cone of light and the dark spaces between the tree trunks. The vocalizations continued, growing slightly louder and more agitated. There was something almost conversational about them, like whatever was out there was trying to communicate. Then I heard an answering call from the other side of the road. My head snapped to the right, and I aimed my flashlight toward the woods on the passenger side. More of those guttural, almost human sounds, coming from at least 2 different sources now. They were talking to each other. I'm not ashamed to admit that I was scared, really scared. I've encountered bears and mountain lions on the road before, but this was different. This felt deliberate, intelligent. I started my engine, damaged hose or no damaged hose. I figured I could make it a few miles before overheating became a serious problem. And right then, a few miles sounded a lot better than staying put. But as I was putting the truck in gear, my headlights swept across the woods on the passenger side, and I saw something that still gives me nightmares. A face. Not human, but not animal either. It was pale, almost luminescent in the darkness, with features that were just wrong enough to trigger every primal fear response I had. The eyes were too large, set too far apart. The mouth was too wide, stretching almost from ear to ear, and it was tall. I could tell even from my elevated position in the cab that whatever this thing was, it was at least 8 feet tall. It was standing between 2 trees, partially hidden, watching me. Our eyes met for just a moment, but it felt like an eternity. There was intelligence there, awareness, but also something predatory and alien. Then it smiled. That smile. I can't describe it properly. Imagine someone who's never seen a human smile trying to replicate one based on a poor description. Too wide, too many teeth, more of a grimace than any expression of friendliness. I floored the accelerator. The truck lurched forward, engine already beginning to overheat, but I didn't care. I had to get away from whatever was in those woods. Behind me, I could hear those vocalizations again, louder now, coming from multiple sources on both sides of the road. They were following me. I could see shapes moving through the trees, keeping pace with my truck. Not running exactly, but covering ground with those same long, deliberate strides I'd heard earlier. Every few seconds, my headlights would catch a glimpse of pale skin or those horrible, too large eyes. The temperature gauge was redlining now, and steam was beginning to pour from under the hood, but I kept driving. The creatures, and I had no doubt now that's what they were, stayed with me for about 2 miles before finally falling back into the darkness. I made it another 5 miles before the engine finally seized up completely. But by then, I was in a more populated area, with houses and streetlights visible. I called for a tow truck and spent the rest of the night in a motel, checking and rechecking the locks on the door. The next morning, I called the Oregon State Police and tried to report what I'd seen, but I could tell the officer thought I was either drunk or crazy. He took down my information, but clearly wasn't planning to do anything with it. I asked around at the truck stop, where I was waiting for my engine to be repaired. Most drivers just looked at me like I was nuts, but one older guy, been driving these mountains for 30 years, pulled me aside. "You saw them," he said. It wasn't a question. "Saw what?" "The things in the woods. On 26, right? Between Government Camp and Madras." I nodded, stunned. "There's been reports for decades," he said quietly. "Drivers, hikers, hunters. Most people don't talk about it because they think no one will believe them. But there's something in those woods, something that ain't natural." "What do you think they are?" He shrugged. "Does it matter? Point is, they're there. And they seem to be curious about vehicles, especially at night. Most of the time, they just watch. But sometimes, sometimes what? Sometimes people don't come back out of those woods. I haven't driven Highway 26 at night since then. Hell, I try to avoid it during the day if I can. I keep thinking about that face, that impossible smile, those sounds they were making. They were communicating, coordinating, hunting. And I can't shake the feeling that next time I might not be so lucky." Story 4. The impossible convoy sound effect. Wind across open plains, distant thunder. Janet Williams has been driving team with her husband Robert for 12 years, covering long-distance routes across the American heartland. They're experienced professionals who take pride in their safety record and their reputation for reliability. But their experience on Interstate 70 in Kansas last spring has left them questioning everything they thought they knew about the road. Janet called me after seeing our website, and she was insistent that I understand something from the beginning. She and her husband are not the kind of people who see things. They don't believe in ghosts. They don't make up stories. And they've never had an experience like this before or since. That's what makes their account so compelling. Here's their story, as told by Janet. "Robert and I have been running the roads together for over a decade. We've seen everything, every kind of weather, every type of cargo, every variety of crazy driver you can imagine. We're methodical people. We follow procedures. We maintain our equipment. And we don't take risks. That's how we've stayed safe and profitable all these years. So when I tell you what happened to us on I-70 in Kansas, I want you to understand that we're not given to flights of fancy. We know the difference between reality and hallucination, between fact and fiction. What we saw that night was impossible, but we both saw it, and we saw it clearly. We were hauling a load of agricultural equipment from Illinois to Colorado, running through the night to avoid the heat. Robert was driving while I tried to catch some sleep in the bunk. But the road was smooth and the truck was quiet, so I wasn't having much luck. It was about 2:30 in the morning, and we were somewhere in western Kansas, that long, flat stretch where you can see for miles in every direction during the day. But at night, It's just endless darkness, broken only by the occasional farmhouse light. Robert had been quiet for the past hour or so, which wasn't unusual. He's always been a contemplative driver, especially on these long, straight stretches. But something in his posture caught my attention. He was leaning forward slightly, peering intently at something ahead. "What is it?" I asked, climbing out of the bunk. "Look at this," he said, pointing ahead. In the distance, maybe 2 or 3 miles out, I could see lights. A lot of lights. At first glance, it looked like a convoy. Multiple vehicles traveling together in a tight formation. "Military," I suggested. "We see military convoys fairly regularly on the interstates, usually moving equipment between bases." "Maybe," Robert said, but he sounded uncertain. "But look at how they're arranged." I looked more carefully. The lights were perfectly aligned, moving at exactly the same speed, maintaining precise distances between them. There had to be at least 20 vehicles, maybe more, all in a perfectly straight line. "That's some impressive formation driving," I said. "Yeah," Robert agreed. "Too impressive." As we got closer, more details became visible. The convoy stretched much further than I'd initially thought. There had to be at least 50 vehicles, maybe more. The lights were bright, much brighter than normal headlights, and they had an odd, almost blue-white quality that I'd never seen before. "Those aren't regular headlights," Robert said, echoing my thoughts. "Maybe they're using some kind of special equipment," I suggested. "New LED arrays, or something." But even as I said it, I knew it didn't sound right. There was something off about the whole thing, something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. We continued closing the distance, and that's when we noticed something even stranger. The convoy wasn't on the road. I know how that sounds. I know it's impossible, but I'm telling you exactly what we saw. The lights were parallel to the highway, maybe a quarter mile to the north, moving across the open prairie at the same speed we were traveling. "Robert," I said quietly, "are you seeing this?" "Yeah," he replied, his voice tight. "I'm seeing it." There was no road where those lights were traveling. No path, no trail, nothing but open grassland. Yet the convoy was moving in a perfectly straight line, maintaining that precise formation, as if they were following some invisible highway. We watched in stunned silence as the convoy kept pace with us. Mile after mile, those impossible lights continued their parallel journey across the prairie. No deviation, no change in speed, no break in formation. "This has to be some kind of optical illusion," I said. "Maybe reflections from our own lights, or ... from 50 different sources," Robert interrupted, "all moving independently." He was right. There was no way this could be a reflection or a mirage. We were seeing individual lights, each with its own movement, its own position in the formation. I grabbed our CB radio and tried to raise other drivers in the area. "Breaker 19 for any eastbound or westbound traffic on I-70 in Kansas. Anyone else seeing the convoy running parallel to the highway? Static." I tried again. "Any traffic on I-70. This is the westbound team in the Freightliner. We've got visual on what looks like a large convoy running north of the highway. Anyone copy?" More static. Either we were alone on this stretch of road, or nobody else was seeing what we were seeing. "Robert," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "I see them." The lights were approaching fast, much faster than any ground vehicle should be able to move across rough prairie. And as they got closer, we could see that there were no vehicles at all. For just a moment, our headlights illuminated the space where they were traveling, and there was nothing there. No vehicles, no aircraft, no explanation for what was generating those lights. And then they were gone, disappearing into the darkness to the south as suddenly as they'd appeared. We sat in the restaurant for 2 hours, going over every detail, trying to come up with some rational explanation. Military aircraft, too low, and we would have heard engines. Weather phenomenon. Nothing we'd ever heard of could account for what we'd seen. Mass hallucination. Both of us, simultaneously, seeing the same impossible thing. We talked to other drivers at the truck stop, but nobody else had seen anything unusual. We called the Kansas Highway Patrol, but they had no reports of military convoys or unusual activity in the area. That was 6 months ago, and we still don't have any answers. We've driven that same stretch of I-70 dozens of times since then, and we've never seen anything like it again. But we know what we saw that night. A convoy of lights, with no vehicles, traveling across open prairie in perfect formation, defying every law of physics and common sense we know. To understand that what we were witnessing was real, but understand what exactly? That's the question that keeps me awake at night. The road is full of mysteries, things we can't explain or understand. But sometimes, on those long, lonely stretches of highway, the impossible becomes visible. And once you've seen it, you can never quite look at the darkness the same way again. Story 5. The Shadow on the Pass. Tom Bradley is a veteran driver with over 20 years of experience hauling freight through some of America's most challenging terrain. He specializes in mountain runs, navigating treacherous passes and steep grades that would intimidate less experienced drivers. But his encounter on Monarch Pass in Colorado last winter left him shaken in ways he's still trying to understand. And he finally decided he needed to tell someone what he saw that night on the Continental Divide. Here's Tom's account. I've been driving mountain passes for most of my adult life. Monarch Pass, Wolf Creek Pass, Eisenhower Tunnel. I know them all like the back of my hand. I know where the ice forms first, where the wind hits hardest, where the grades are steepest. I know how to read the weather, how to chain up in a hurry, how to keep my rig moving when lesser drivers get stuck. But what happened to me on Monarch Pass last December, that was different. That was something no amount of experience could have prepared me for. I was hauling a load of industrial supplies from Denver to Grand Junction, running a night schedule to avoid the tourist traffic that clogs the mountain roads during the day. The weather was clear but cold. Temperature probably around 10 below zero at pass elevation. Monarch Pass peaks out at about 11,300 feet, and even in good weather, it's a challenging drive. Steep grades, tight curves, and the constant threat of altitude sickness for drivers who aren't acclimated to the elevation. The shape behind me was too large, too dark. It wasn't reflecting my taillights the way a normal vehicle would, and it was staying perfectly centered in my lane, matching my speed exactly, even though I was climbing a steep grade and constantly adjusting my speed for the curves. I reached for my CB to try to contact the driver behind me, but when I looked in the mirror again, there was nothing there, just empty highway stretching back down the mountain. Must be getting tired, I muttered to myself, and focused on the road ahead. But 10 minutes later, it was back. The shape behind me wasn't a vehicle at all, but it had no lights, no defining features, just a solid black mass that seemed to absorb the light from my taillights, and it was floating about 3 feet off the ground. I blinked hard, shook my head, looked again, still there, a massive shadow following my truck up the mountain, keeping perfect pace despite the fact that it had no visible means of propulsion. My rational mind was screaming that this was impossible, that I must be hallucinating from altitude or fatigue or stress. But I've been driving these mountains for 20 years, and I know the difference between a trick of the light and something real. This was real. The shadow stayed with me for the next 5 miles, through hairpin turns and steep grades. Every time I checked my mirrors, there it was. That impossible black mass hovering behind my trailer like some kind of supernatural escort. Then I hit the summit. Monarch Pass has a small parking area at the top where tourists stop to take pictures, and truckers sometimes pull over to check their brakes before starting the descent. As I crested the pass, I saw something that made me hit the brakes hard enough to engage my abs. There were more of them. Dozens of the shadow shapes were gathered around the summit, floating silently in the thin mountain air. Some were small, maybe the size of cars. Others were massive, bigger than my rig, bigger than anything that had any right to be airborne. They were all perfectly still, arranged in what looked almost like a formation. And they were all facing the road, as if they were waiting for something, as if they were waiting for me. I sat there for maybe 30 seconds, engine idling, trying to process what I was seeing. The shadows weren't threatening, exactly, but there was something deeply unsettling about them. They were too organized, too purposeful to be natural phenomena. Then, slowly, they began to move. Not toward me, but away from the road, drifting silently into the darkness that surrounded the pass. One by one, they disappeared into the night until only the shadow behind my truck remained. I put the truck back in gear and started the descent down the western slope. The shadow stayed with me for another few miles before finally peeling away and vanishing into a stand of aspen trees. The rest of the drive to Grand Junction was uneventful, but I couldn't stop thinking about what I'd seen. When I got to the delivery point, I asked around to see if anyone else had experienced anything similar on Monarch Pass. Most people just looked at me like I was crazy, but one of the dock workers, an older guy who'd lived in the area his whole life, pulled me aside. "You saw them, didn't you?" he said quietly. "Saw what?" "The shadows." "On the pass?" I nodded, not trusting my voice. "My grandfather used to tell stories about them," he continued. "Said they'd been seen on Monarch Pass for as long as anyone could remember. The Ute Indians who lived in these mountains had legends about shadow spirits that guarded the high places. What do you think they are?" He shrugged. "Does it matter? Point is, they're there. And from what I've heard, they don't bother anyone who's just passing through. But if you're up to no good on their mountain, ... He didn't finish the sentence, but the implication was clear. I've driven Monarch Pass maybe 20 times since that night, and I've never seen the shadows again. But I'm always watching for them, always checking my mirrors, always wondering if they're there, but just choosing not to show themselves. The mountains are old, older than human civilization, older than anything we can really comprehend. Maybe some places accumulate ... things. Maybe elevation and isolation and the thin air at 11,000 feet create conditions where the impossible becomes possible. Or maybe I'm just losing my mind. But I know what I saw that night on Monarch Pass, and I know I wasn't alone on that mountain. Story 6. The radio from nowhere. Maria Santos has been a long-haul driver for 9 years, specializing in cross-country routes that take her through some of America's most remote territories. She's a practical woman who prides herself on her mechanical knowledge and her ability to handle any situation the road throws at her. But her experience on Highway 285 in New Mexico challenged everything she thought she knew about the limits of possibility. Maria contacted me through our website after months of trying to rationalize what had happened to her. She'd researched atmospheric phenomena, radio propagation, and every possible scientific explanation she could find, but none of them could account for what she heard that night in the desert. Here's Maria's story. I grew up around radios. My father was a ham radio operator, and some of my earliest memories are of sitting in his shack, listening to voices from around the world crackling through the static. I learned about frequency propagation, atmospheric interference, skip phenomena, all the ways radio waves can behave strangely under the right conditions. So when I tell you what I heard on my CB radio that night in New Mexico, I want you to understand that I know the difference between normal radio anomalies and something that defies explanation. I was hauling a load of electronics from El Paso to Albuquerque, running the night shift to avoid the brutal desert heat. Highway 285 through that part of New Mexico is about as desolate as it gets. Hundreds of miles of high desert scrub, with maybe one small town every 50 miles. It was about 3 in the morning when my CB radio started acting up. I was monitoring Channel 19, listening to the usual late-night chatter from other drivers, when the signal began to fade in and out. At first, I thought it might be equipment failure, but the radio had been working fine all night. Then I started hearing other voices, not the normal trucker chatter, but conversations that didn't make any sense. People talking about places I'd never heard of, using terminology that was completely unfamiliar. And the voices themselves were strange. They had an odd quality, like they were being transmitted from very far away or through some kind of filter. I tried adjusting the squelch and scanning other channels, but the strange transmissions were everywhere. Channel 19, Channel 17, even the emergency channels were filled with these bizarre conversations. Base to Mobile Unit 77 Alpha came one transmission. Report your position relative to the convergence point. Mobile 77 Alpha to base. We're approximately 2 clicks south of the tertiary marker. No visual contact with the subjects yet. Understood. Maintain surveillance and report any anomalous activity. I grabbed my mic and tried to break into the conversation. Breaker for the units discussing surveillance. This is a civilian driver on Highway 285. What's your location? Silence. Then a different voice came through, cold and professional. Civilian traffic. You are monitoring restricted communications. Please switch to an alternate frequency. Restricted communications, I replied. This is an open CB channel. Who are you people? But there was no response. The strange transmissions continued, but it was as if I'd become invisible to them. For the next hour, I listened to what sounded like some kind of coordinated operation. Multiple units reporting positions, discussing subjects and anomalous activity and containment protocols. The language was clinical, military sounding, but the context made no sense. Then I heard something that made my blood run cold. Command, this is observation, post 3. We have visual on a eastbound semi-trailer, single occupant, license plate, ... single quotes, and then they read off my exact license plate number. I immediately looked around, scanning the darkness for any sign of other vehicles or observation posts. There was nothing, just empty desert stretching to the horizon in all directions. Command copies. Continue monitoring. Do not engage unless the subject deviates from the prescribed route. Subject. They were talking about me. I grabbed my CB mic with shaking hands. This is the eastbound semi you're discussing. Who are you, and why are you watching me? Silence. I tried again. I'm a civilian driver on a legal run. I demand to know who you are and why you're conducting surveillance on me. Still nothing. But the transmissions continued, and I could hear them discussing my progress, my speed, even my fuel level. Information they couldn't possibly have unless they had access to my truck's computer systems. That's when I made a decision that probably saved my life. Instead of continuing on my planned route, I took the next exit and pulled into a 24-hour truck stop. I needed to get around other people, needed to figure out what was happening. The moment I took the exit, the radio exploded with activity. Command. The subject has deviated from route. Repeat. Subject has deviated from the prescribed path. All units converge on the truck stop. Maintain visual contact, but do not approach. Copy that. Command. Units 2 and 5 are en route. I parked my truck and ran into the truck stop, looking for help, looking for answers, looking for anyone who could explain what was happening. The night clerk was a young guy who looked at me like I was crazy when I tried to explain about the radio transmissions. There's nobody here but you and a couple other drivers, he said. And I haven't seen any government vehicles or anything like that. I asked to use his phone to call the state police, but when I picked up the receiver, instead of a dial tone, I heard more of those strange transmissions. Containment protocol is now in effect. Subject must not be allowed to continue east. I dropped the phone like it was on fire. The clerk stared at me. Lady, are you okay? You look like you've seen a ghost. Can you hear that? I asked, pointing at the phone. He picked up the receiver and listened. Just a dial tone, he said. I grabbed the phone back. Dial tone. The strange transmissions had stopped. I spent the rest of the night in that truck stop, too scared to leave, too confused to know what to do. When morning came, I called my dispatcher and told them I was having mechanical problems, that I needed to abort the run and head back to El Paso. The return trip was uneventful. No strange radio transmissions, no surveillance reports, no mysterious voices, just normal highway noise and trucker chatter on the CB. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd stumbled into something I wasn't supposed to see, heard something I wasn't supposed to hear. Those transmissions were too professional, too coordinated to be a hoax or a prank, but they were also too strange, too impossible to be real. I've thought about that night countless times over the past year. I've researched military operations in New Mexico, secret government facilities, experimental aircraft programs. That part of the state is home to several classified installations, including facilities that most people have never heard of. Maybe I picked up transmissions from one of those operations. Maybe my CB radio somehow intercepted encrypted military communications. Maybe I was in the wrong place at the wrong time and heard something that was never meant for civilian ears. Or maybe there are things happening in the desert that we're not supposed to know about. Operations involving subjects and anomalous activity and containment protocols. I don't know. I may never know. But I've never driven Highway 285 at night again. And sometimes, when I'm monitoring my CB on other routes, I think I hear echoes of those voices, fragments of transmissions discussing things that don't officially exist. The desert keeps its secrets, well, but sometimes, on the right frequency, At the right time, those secrets leak through. Story 7. The Lights in the Bayou. Claude Thibodeau has been driving freight through the Gulf Coast states for 18 years. Born and raised in Louisiana, he knows the back roads and bayou highways better than most, and he's comfortable with the region's reputation for supernatural phenomena. But his experience on Highway 90 near the Atchafalaya Basin last summer was unlike anything he'd encountered before. Claude called me after hearing about our collection from another driver. He was hesitant to share his story, worried that people would dismiss it as another tall tale from the Louisiana swamps. But what he saw that night was witnessed by multiple people, and the evidence left behind defied easy explanation. Here's Claude's account. I've lived in Louisiana my whole life, and I grew up hearing stories about the strange things that happen in our swamps. Rougarou, ghosts, lights that dance through the Spanish moss. It's all part of the culture down here. Most of it's just folklore, stories passed down through generations to entertain children and tourists. But some of it's real. I was running a load of petroleum equipment from New Orleans to Lake Charles, taking Highway 90 through the Atchafalaya Basin. This is some of the wildest, most remote territory in Louisiana. Hundreds of thousands of acres of swamp and wetland that haven't changed much since the Acadians first settled here 3 centuries ago. It was late August, humid as hell, even at midnight, with thunderstorms building to the west. The air was so thick you could practically drink it, and my air conditioning was working overtime to keep the cab comfortable. I was about halfway through the basin, running through a stretch where the highway is elevated on concrete pillars above the swampland, when I first saw the lights. At first, I thought they might be aircraft, helicopters, or small planes flying low over the swamp. But they were moving too slowly, too deliberately, and they were completely silent. There were maybe a dozen of them, brilliant white orbs about the size of beach balls, floating just above the water level, maybe a quarter-mile south of the highway. They were arranged in a rough circle, pulsing gently like they were breathing. Swamp gas, I said to myself. Down here, you learn early about the natural phenomena that can create strange lights in the wetlands. Methane bubbles, phosphorescent algae, even ball lightning. The swamp is full of things that can play tricks on your eyes. But as I watched, the lights began to move, not randomly, like you'd expect from a natural phenomenon, but with clear purpose and intelligence. They maintained their circular formation while drifting slowly through the cypress trees, weaving between the massive trunks like they were following some invisible path. I slowed down to get a better look, and that's when I noticed I wasn't alone. Cars and trucks were pulling over on both sides of the highway, drivers and passengers getting out to watch the light show in the swamp. I counted at least a dozen vehicles, all stopped to observe the impossible dance happening in the darkness below. I pulled over too and climbed out of my cab. The air was thick with the smell of decay and growing things, punctuated by the sound of insects and night birds. But underneath all that was something else, a low, almost subliminal humming that seemed to come from the direction of the lights. "You seeing this?" called out another trucker from across the highway. "Yeah," I replied. "What do you think it is?" "Damned if I know. But it ain't swamp gas." He was right. Whatever those lights were, they were displaying behavior that no natural phenomenon could account for. As we watched, they began to change formation, spreading out into a long line that stretched across maybe half a mile of swampland. Then they started to pulse in sequence, like a wave of light moving from one end of the line to the other. over and over, with perfect timing and coordination. Someone called the news stations, suggested a woman who'd gotten out of her car with her family. This needs to be recorded. Several people were already taking photos and videos with their phones. But when they tried to review the footage, there was nothing there. Just darkness where the lights should have been. "That's impossible," muttered one guy, checking his camera settings. "I was recording the whole time. I tried taking a picture with my own phone, with the same result. The camera could capture everything else, the highway, the other vehicles, the swamp, but the lights themselves refused to be recorded." That's when things got really strange. The lights suddenly converged back into their original circular formation, then began to rise, slowly at first, then with increasing speed, until they were maybe 100 feet above the water. From that height, they began to pulse more rapidly, and the humming sound grew louder. Then, without warning, they shot straight up into the sky, not gradually, like a balloon or aircraft gaining altitude, but instantly, like someone had fired them from a cannon. One moment they were floating above the swamp, the next they were gone, leaving nothing but darkness and the normal sounds of the bayou night. The crowd of observers stood in stunned silence for several minutes, trying to process what we'd just witnessed. Gradually, people began to return to their vehicles, muttering to each other about what they'd seen. But as I was climbing back into my truck, I heard someone calling my name. Claude Thibodeau. I turned around, confused. The voice was coming from the direction of the swamp, but I couldn't see anyone there. "Claude, you need to listen." The voice was clearer now, and I recognized it. It was my grandfather's voice. My grandfather who'd been dead for 15 years. I walked to the guardrail and peered down into the darkness. "Grand P, the lights, Claude. They're not what people think. They're markers. Markers for what? For the crossing places, the thin spots where our world touches the other side." I felt a chill run down my spine, despite the humid heat. "What are you talking about? The old stories are true, boy. The swamp remembers everything, and sometimes, when conditions are right, the barriers get thin." "Grand P, you're scaring me." "Good, you should be scared. Those lights mark places where things can cross over, and lately, more and more things have been crossing." "What things?" But there was no answer. The voice was gone, leaving only the sound of insects and the distant rumble of thunder. I stood there for another 10 minutes, waiting for more, but the swamp had returned to its normal nighttime rhythm. Finally, I climbed back into my truck and continued my run to Lake Charles. The next morning, I called my cousin Boudreaux, who works for the Louisiana Department of Wildlife and Fisheries. I asked him if there had been any reports of unusual activity in the Atchafalaya Basin. "Funny you should ask," he said. "We've been getting calls for weeks about strange lights in the swamp. Multiple witnesses, consistent descriptions, but no one can get any video or photos that show anything." "What's the official explanation?" "Swamp gas, unusual weather conditions, mass hallucination. Take your pick. But between you and me, cousin, I think there's something else going on out there." "Like what?" "I don't know. But my grandmother used to tell stories about lights in the swamp that weren't natural. Said they marked places where the spirit world and our world overlapped. You believe that?" "Down here, Claude, it pays to keep an open mind about things like that. I've driven through the Atchafalaya Basin dozens of times since that night, but I've never seen the lights again. Other drivers tell me they're still appearing, still refusing to be photographed, still drawing crowds of confused observers to the side of Highway 90. but I haven't seen my grandfather again either. And I'm not sure if that's a good thing or not. The swamp keeps its secrets, but sometimes those secrets reveal themselves to those who know how to look. And sometimes those revelations come with warnings that we ignore at our own peril. Whatever those lights are, whatever they represent, they're part of something larger than we understand. And my grandfather's voice, speaking from beyond the grave, suggested that the barriers between worlds are getting thinner. That thought keeps me awake at night, especially when I'm driving through the lonely stretches of Louisiana highway, where the swamp presses close to the road and the darkness holds mysteries that science can't explain. Story 8, The Emergency Broadcast. David Park has been driving international routes between the United States and Canada for 11 years. He's familiar with cross-border procedures, customs, regulations, and the challenges of navigating the remote highways that connect the two countries. But his experience on Highway 2 in North Dakota, near the Canadian border, challenged his understanding of how communication systems work. David reached out to me after spending months trying to find a rational explanation for what he heard on his radio that night. He'd contacted the FCC, the Canadian Radio, Television and Telecommunications Commission, and multiple broadcasting companies, but no one could account for the transmission he received. Here's David's story. I make regular runs between Minneapolis and Winnipeg, hauling automotive parts for a manufacturer that has facilities on both sides of the border. It's a routine route, one I've driven hundreds of times. But the long stretches of highway through North Dakota can be challenging, especially in winter. This happened last February during one of the worst cold snaps in recent memory. Temperatures were hovering around 30 below zero, and the wind was creating whiteout conditions across the prairie. I was making good time despite the weather, but visibility was limited, and I was grateful for every mile marker that confirmed I was still on course. I was about 20 miles south of the Canadian border, somewhere between Grand Forks and the Pembina crossing, when my radio started acting strangely. I'd been listening to a talk radio station out of Fargo, but the signal was gradually being overwhelmed by static and interference. That's normal for that area. You're far enough from major population centers that radio reception can be spotty, especially in bad weather. I was scanning for a clearer signal when I picked up something that made me pull over. It was an emergency broadcast. Not the weekly test that everyone's familiar with, but an actual emergency alert. The distinctive tones came through clearly, followed by a computerized voice announcing a message from the emergency alert system. This is an emergency alert from the National Weather Service and the Department of Homeland Security, the voice said. A severe weather event has created hazardous conditions across the northern border region. All civilian traffic is advised to seek immediate shelter and avoid travel on highways 2, 29, and 81 until further notice. I was confused. The weather was bad, but not severe enough to warrant stopping all traffic. I'd driven through much worse conditions. Plus, I'd checked the weather forecast before leaving Minneapolis, and there were no warnings about anything catastrophic. But then the message continued, and what I heard next made my blood run cold. In addition to severe weather conditions, authorities are investigating reports of unusual atmospheric phenomena in the border region. Civilian aircraft have reported instrument malfunctions and navigation errors. Ground-based observers have documented unexplained lights and electromagnetic disturbances. Electromagnetic disturbances. I'd never heard that mentioned in a weather alert before. All travelers in the affected area are advised to maintain radio contact with emergency services and report any unusual sightings or equipment malfunctions immediately. If you encounter any phenomena that appear to be of non-meteorological origin, do not investigate. Proceed to the nearest populated area and contact authorities. Non-meteorological origin. What did that mean? The alert continued for another minute, providing a phone number for reporting unusual incidents and repeating the warning about avoiding the highway. Then it ended with the standard emergency alert sign-off. I sat in my idling truck, trying to process what I'd just heard. This wasn't like any emergency broadcast I'd ever encountered. Weather alerts don't usually mention electromagnetic disturbances or non-meteorological phenomena. I tried calling the number they'd provided, but my cell phone had no signal. Not unusual in that remote area, but frustrating given the circumstances. I switched to my CB radio to see if I could raise other drivers in the area, but the channels were strangely quiet. No chatter, no conversation, just occasional bursts of static. That's when I noticed the lights to the north, in the direction of the Canadian border. Strange auroras were dancing across the sky, but these weren't like the northern lights I'd seen before. They were too bright, too active, and they were moving in patterns that seemed almost geometric. Bands of green and blue light were forming perfect spirals and hexagons, pulsing and shifting with mechanical precision. It was beautiful, but deeply unsettling, like watching something that wasn't quite natural. I grabbed my CB mic and tried to contact anyone who might be monitoring. Breaker 19 for any traffic on Highway 2 near the Canadian border. Anyone else seeing these lights? Static. Any station, this is a southbound driver, about 20 miles from Pembina. I'm seeing unusual aurora activity, and I received an emergency broadcast about electromagnetic disturbances. Anyone copy? More static. But this time, I thought I heard something underneath it. Voices, maybe, but too distorted to understand. I tried my regular radio again, scanning through all the available frequencies. Most were dead, but on 1 a.m. band, I picked up what sounded like a news broadcast. Single quotes, ... confirmed reports from both U.S. and Canadian authorities of widespread instrument failures affecting aircraft and ground-based navigation systems. The phenomena appears to be centered along the international border and is affecting an area roughly 50 miles wide. I turned up the volume, straining to hear more. Military sources, speaking on condition of anonymity, have confirmed that NORAD has been tracking unusual electromagnetic signatures in the affected area for the past 6 hours. While officials refuse to speculate on the cause, they have temporarily suspended all civilian air traffic in the region. NORAD, they don't get involved in weather events. Local residents have reported seeing lights in the sky that don't match any known atmospheric phenomena. Several witnesses describe geometric patterns and synchronized movements that suggest artificial rather than natural origin. The signal was getting weaker, fading in and out as interference increased. We'll continue to monitor this developing situation and bring you updates as they become available. This is KFGO News, Fargo. Then the signal was gone, replaced by static. I sat there for another 20 minutes, watching the impossible light show in the northern sky and trying to decide what to do. The emergency broadcast had warned against travel, but I was already committed to my route and didn't have many options for shelter in this remote area. Finally, I decided to continue north, but slowly and carefully, ready to turn around if conditions got worse. The lights continued for another hour as I drove toward the border, growing brighter and more active as I got closer. By the time I reached the Pembina crossing, the entire northern horizon was alive with swirling geometric patterns of light. But the strangest thing was what happened at the border station. The Canadian customs officer who processed my paperwork acted like nothing unusual was happening. When I asked about the lights, he just shrugged. "Northern lights," he said. "Pretty common up here, but the emergency broadcast." "What emergency broadcast?" I tried to explain what I'd heard, but he looked at me like I was talking nonsense. According to him, there had been no emergency alerts, no warnings about electromagnetic disturbances, no reports of unusual phenomena. "Weather's been rough," he said, "but nothing out of the ordinary for this time of year." When I got to Winnipeg, I immediately tried to find information about the emergency broadcast and the phenomena I'd witnessed. I called radio stations, checked news websites, contacted government agencies. Nobody had any record of the alert I'd heard. The official weather reports for that night mentioned nothing unusual. No electromagnetic disturbances, no instrument failures, no geometric auroras. According to every official source I could find, that night was completely normal. But I know what I heard, and I know what I saw. That emergency broadcast was real. Those lights were real. And whatever was happening along the border that night was definitely not normal weather. I've made that same run dozens of times since then, and I've never encountered anything like it again. But sometimes, when I'm approaching the border on a clear night, I find myself scanning the radio frequencies, listening for echoes of that impossible broadcast, and sometimes, just sometimes, I think I hear fragments of it, pieces of transmissions, warning about phenomena that don't officially exist, about disturbances in the electromagnetic spectrum that no government agency will acknowledge. The border between worlds, it seems, is sometimes more than just a line on a map. Story 9. The Truck That Wasn't There. Rachel Martinez has been driving cross-country routes for 14 years, specializing in expedited freight that requires tight schedules and night driving. She's known for her professionalism and reliability, which makes her experience on Interstate 10 in West Texas all the more puzzling. Rachel contacted me after months of trying to rationalize what she'd experienced. She'd researched optical illusions, mirage phenomena, and fatigue-related hallucinations, but none of the explanations she found could account for what she saw that night in the Chihuahuan desert. Here's Rachel's story. "I've been driving professionally for 14 years, and I've seen just about everything the road can throw at you. I've driven through blizzards, tornadoes, flash floods, and heat waves that would melt asphalt. I've dealt with equipment failures, medical emergencies, and every kind of crazy driver you can imagine. But I've never experienced anything like what happened to me on I-10 in West Texas last October. I was hauling a high-priority load of medical equipment from Houston to Los Angeles, running against a tight deadline that required me to drive through the night. The route took me through some of the most desolate territory in the country, hundreds of miles of Chihuahuan desert where you might not see another vehicle for an hour at a stretch. It was about 2:30 in the morning when I first saw the other truck. I was westbound, about 50 miles east of El Paso, when headlights appeared in my mirrors. Not unusual. Trucks run that route 24 hours a day. But something about this one caught my attention immediately. The headlights were too bright, for one thing. Brilliant white beams that lit up the desert like daylight. and they were perfectly aligned, maintaining exactly the same height and distance from each other, despite the fact that the road had plenty of small bumps and irregularities. I figured it might be a newer truck with high-end LED lighting, but as it got closer, I could see that something was off about the whole vehicle. The truck appeared to be a standard over-the-road tractor trailer, but the proportions were wrong. Too long, too tall, too perfectly symmetrical. And despite those blazing headlights, I couldn't make out any other details. No grille, no windshield, no identifying features of any kind. It was like looking at the shadow of a truck filled with light. The vehicle closed the distance between us rapidly, moving much faster than the speed limit. But instead of passing, it pulled up behind me and matched my speed exactly. For the next 30 miles, that impossible truck stayed exactly 50 feet behind my trailer. When I sped up, it sped up. When I slowed down, it slowed down. When I changed lanes, it changed lanes. Perfect synchronization, like it was tethered to my rig by an invisible cable. I tried raising the driver on the CB, but got no response. I tried flashing my brake lights to signal, but the truck behind me didn't react. It just maintained that perfect, unwavering distance. Finally, I decided to force the issue. There was a truck stop coming up in about 10 miles, and I was going to pull in whether this ghost truck followed me or not. But when I put on my turn signal and started to move toward the exit, something impossible happened. The truck behind me didn't follow the exit ramp. Instead, it continued straight ahead on the interstate, while somehow also following me onto the exit ramp. I know how that sounds. I know it's impossible, but I'm telling you exactly what I saw. In my side mirror, I could see the truck continuing west on I-10, maintaining its course and speed. But in my rear-view mirror, I could see the same truck following me down the exit ramp to the truck stop. Two identical trucks in two different places at the same time. I pulled into a parking space and sat there for several minutes, trying to process what I'd just witnessed. The truck that had followed me onto the exit ramp was nowhere to be seen. The parking lot was nearly empty, with just a few other rigs scattered around. But when I looked back toward the interstate, I could see the other version of the truck continuing its westbound journey. Those impossibly bright headlights cutting through the darkness. I climbed out of my cab and walked around my truck, checking for any sign of the vehicle that had been following me. Nothing. No tire tracks, no diesel exhaust smell, no indication that another truck had been anywhere near me. Inside the truck stop, I asked the night clerk if he'd seen another truck pull in behind me. "Just you," he said, barely looking up from his magazine. "Been quiet all night. There was a truck following me on the interstate. Bright headlights, looked like a newer rig." He shrugged. "Didn't see anything." I bought a cup of coffee and sat by the window, watching the interstate and trying to make sense of what had happened. Every few minutes, a vehicle would pass by. Cars, trucks, the normal late-night traffic, but none of them had the brilliant white headlights or the strange proportions of the truck that had been following me. After about an hour, I decided to continue my run to Los Angeles. Maybe I'd been more tired than I'd realized. Maybe the isolation and darkness had played tricks on my perception. Maybe there was a rational explanation for what I'd experienced. But as I was merging back onto I-10, I saw it again. The truck was waiting for me, pulled over on the shoulder, about a mile west of the truck stop. As soon as I passed it, those blazing headlights lit up and it pulled back onto the interstate behind me. For the next 200 miles, until I reached the outskirts of El Paso, that impossible truck stayed with me, always 50 feet back, always perfectly synchronized with my movements, always refusing to pass or fall behind. The truck appeared to be floating slightly above the road surface, not high enough to be obvious, but just enough that there was a gap between the tires and the asphalt. And despite traveling at 70 miles per hour, there was no dust or debris being kicked up from the road. Most unsettling of all, I gradually realized that the truck was completely silent. No engine noise, no tire noise, no wind resistance, nothing. One moment it was there in my mirrors, those brilliant headlights, steady and unwavering. The next moment, the highway behind me was empty. No fade out, no gradual disappearance. Just there, 1 second, gone the next. I completed my delivery to Los Angeles without any further incidents, but I couldn't stop thinking about what I'd experienced. I'd been followed by something that looked like a truck, acted like a truck, but violated every law of physics I knew. When I got back to Houston, I did some research. I contacted other drivers who regularly run the I-10 corridor through West Texas, asking if anyone had experienced anything similar. Most people thought I was crazy, but a few drivers admitted they'd seen strange things on that stretch of highway. Lights that didn't behave like normal vehicle lights. Vehicles that appeared and disappeared without explanation. Trucks that seemed to be watching other trucks. One driver, a 30-year veteran named Bill Kowalski, pulled me aside after I'd shared my story at a truck stop in San Antonio. "You saw the escort," he said quietly. "The what?" "The escort truck. Some of us have been seeing it for years on that stretch of I-10. It follows drivers, usually at night, usually when they're alone. What is it? Nobody knows for sure." The trucker's name was Jimmy Martinez. Good driver, safety conscious. Never had an accident before, but he'd been pushing too hard, running on too little sleep, trying to make an impossible deadline. I felt a chill run down my spine. Martinez. Yeah, same last name as yours. Probably just a coincidence. But, ... He didn't finish the sentence, but the implication was clear. "Some of us think Jimmy's still out there," he continued, "still trying to make up for that one moment of carelessness, following other drivers, making sure they stay safe, making sure they don't make the same mistake he did. That's impossible, is it? You tell me what else could explain a truck that follows you for 200 miles without ever trying to pass, without ever making a sound, without ever quite touching the road?" I couldn't answer that question then, and I can't answer it now. I've driven I-10 through West Texas dozens of times since that night, but I've never seen the escort truck again. Maybe it only appears when it's needed. Maybe it only follows drivers who are pushing too hard, getting too tired, coming too close to making a fatal mistake. Or maybe I'm losing my mind. But Bill Kowalski wasn't the only driver who'd heard of the escort truck. And Jimmy Martinez was a real person. I looked up the accident report. Everything Bill told me was true. Sometimes I wonder if I would have made it safely through that long desert night without my mysterious escort. I'd been driving for 12 hours straight, fighting fatigue and a tight deadline. Maybe I needed someone watching over me, making sure I stayed alert. Maybe that's what the escort truck does, protects drivers from themselves, from the mistakes that can happen when you're alone on a dark highway with too many miles ahead and too little sleep behind. I'd like to think that's what it was. I'd like to think that somewhere out there in the desert darkness, Jimmy Martinez is still driving, still trying to make things right. Because the alternative, that there are things on the highway that we can't explain or understand. is too frightening to contemplate. Story 10. The Missing Time. Frank Sullivan has been driving long haul for 19 years, specializing in routes through the American West. He's known for his punctuality and attention to detail, which makes his experience on Highway 2 in Montana particularly disturbing. Frank lost 4 hours of his life on that highway, and he has no memory of where they went. Frank was reluctant to share his story, worried that people would think he was having some kind of breakdown. But the evidence of what happened to him is undeniable, and the questions it raises have been haunting him for over a year. Here's Frank's account. I've always been obsessive about time. It comes with the territory. When you're a professional driver, delivery schedules, driving hour regulations, fuel stops, everything runs on precise timing. I log every mile, every stop, every delay. My dispatcher jokes that I'm more accurate than an atomic clock. That's why what happened to me on Highway 2 in Montana is so disturbing. I lost 4 hours of my life, and I have no memory of where they went. I was hauling a load of construction equipment from Minneapolis to Seattle, running on a tight schedule that didn't allow for delays. Highway 2 through northern Montana is one of my regular routes, a long, lonely stretch of road that cuts through some of the most isolated territory in the lower 48. The run started normally. I left Minneapolis right on schedule at 6 p.m. on a Tuesday, planning to drive through the night and reach Great Falls by morning. The weather was clear, traffic was light, and I was making good time. I remember stopping for fuel and a meal break in Grand Forks around 11 p.m. I logged the stop, checked my route, and got back on the road at 11:47 p.m. exactly. I have the fuel receipt and the meal receipt to prove it. The next thing I clearly remember is sitting in my truck at a rest area near Cut Bank, Montana, with sunlight streaming through my windshield. I looked at my watch for 15 p.m. Wednesday afternoon. That was impossible. According to my calculations, I should have reached Cut Bank around 9 a.m. that morning. I had somehow lost over 7 hours. But when I checked my logbook, it showed that I had arrived at the rest area at 12:15 p.m. and had been on a mandatory rest break ever since. The entries were in my handwriting, but I had no memory of writing them. My truck's computer confirmed the timeline in my logbook. According to the electronic logs, I had driven from Grand Forks to Cut Bank in exactly the right amount of time, following all regulations for driving hours and rest periods. But I remembered none of it. The last clear memory I had was leaving Grand Forks just before midnight on Tuesday. The next clear memory was waking up at the rest area Wednesday afternoon. Everything in between was a complete blank. I sat there for an hour trying to piece together what had happened. Maybe I'd been more tired than I'd realized. Maybe I'd driven on autopilot and just forgot the details. But 7 hours of missing memories. That wasn't normal fatigue. I called my dispatcher to report my location and estimated arrival time in Seattle. Everything seemed normal from his end. I was exactly where I was supposed to be, exactly when I was supposed to be there. How was the drive through the reservation? He asked, referring to the stretch of Highway 2 that passes through the Little Shell Tribe and Fort Belknap Indian Reservation. It was uneventful, I replied, though I had no memory of it at all. Good to hear. That stretch can be tricky at night, especially with all the construction they've been doing. Construction. I didn't remember any construction, but then again, I didn't remember anything about that part of the drive. I decided to continue on to Seattle, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was seriously wrong. I'd never experienced memory loss like this before. 7 hours of my life gone without a trace. When I reached Seattle and completed my delivery, I immediately drove to the nearest hospital and asked to be examined. I was worried about everything from stroke to brain tumor to carbon monoxide poisoning. The doctors ran every test they could think of. Blood work, neurological exams, CT scans, MRIs. Everything came back normal. No signs of illness, no indication of any medical condition that could cause memory loss. Have you been under a lot of stress lately? The neurologist asked. No more than usual. Any history of sleep disorders, substance abuse, psychiatric issues? None. Well, isolated incidents of memory loss can sometimes occur without any underlying pathology. It's rare, but not unheard of. I'd recommend following up with your regular physician. But there's no indication of any serious medical problem. That should have been reassuring, but it wasn't. Healthy people don't just lose 7 hours of memory for no reason. When I got back home, I started researching. I contacted other drivers who regularly run Highway 2 through Montana, asking if anyone had experienced anything unusual on that route. Most people thought I was crazy, but a few drivers admitted they'd had strange experiences on that stretch of highway. Missing time, gaps in memory, periods where they couldn't account for their location or activities. One driver, an old-timer named George Hayes, told me about his own experience from 5 years earlier. I was running eastbound from Spokane to Minneapolis, he said. Last thing I remember clearly was passing through Havre around midnight. Next thing I knew, I was at a truck stop in Menite, North Dakota, and it was 8 o'clock the next morning. How much time did you lose? About 6 hours. But according to my logs and my truck's computer, everything was normal. Perfect driving times, regulation, rest breaks, no delays or incidents. Did you ever figure out what happened? He shook his head. Saw every doctor I could afford, had every test they could think of. Nothing wrong with me medically, but I'll tell you something strange. I felt different after that trip, more alert, more focused, like something had reset my brain. Different, hard to explain. But I never had another accident, never had another close call. It was like something had fine-tuned my driving abilities. Now that he mentioned it, I realized I'd been experiencing something similar. Since my missing time incident, my driving had been almost supernaturally precise. Perfect fuel economy, perfect timing, instinctive awareness of road conditions and traffic patterns. I started asking more questions, reaching out to drivers who'd had similar experiences. What I found was disturbing. Over the past 15 years, at least a dozen drivers had reported missing time incidents on Highway 2 through Montana, all of them on the stretch that passes through the Indian reservations, all of them at night, all of them losing between 4 and 8 hours of memory, and all of them reported enhanced driving abilities afterward. It's like someone or something is upgrading us, said one driver, taking us offline for a few hours and installing better software. That sounded crazy, but I couldn't deny the evidence. My driving skills had improved dramatically since the incident. My fuel efficiency was up 20%. My accident avoidance reactions were faster. My ability to read road conditions was almost psychic. I started researching the history of that area, looking for anything that might explain the phenomena. What I found was fascinating and terrifying. The stretch of Highway 2, where these incidents occur, passes through territory that has been considered sacred by Native American tribes for thousands of years. According to tribal legends, It's a place where the spirit world and the physical world intersect. More recently, there have been numerous UFO sightings in the area, reports of strange lights and unidentified aircraft. The Air Force has officially denied any connection to their operations, but locals say military vehicles are frequently seen in the area. Some researchers believe the region is what they call a temporal anomaly zone, an area where time moves differently, where the normal rules of physics don't apply. Maybe that's what happened to me and the other drivers. Maybe we encountered something that exists outside normal space and time. Maybe we were taken somewhere else, somehow enhanced or modified, then returned with no memory of the experience. Or maybe we're all losing our minds. I don't know. I may never know. But I do know that something happened to me on Highway 2 in Montana. Something that medical science can't explain. Something that has fundamentally changed the way I experience driving. And I know that I'm not the only one. There are others out there, drivers who've lost time on that lonely stretch of highway, drivers who've come back different. We don't talk about it much. Who would believe us? But we recognize each other on the road, in the truck stops, at the shipping terminals. We're the ones who never have accidents anymore. The ones who seem to know instinctively when to slow down, when to change lanes, when to take a different route. The ones who've been upgraded. I still drive Highway 2 through Montana, though I'm always nervous when I approach that stretch through the reservations. Part of me is terrified that it will happen again, but part of me is curious about what I might learn this time, what other enhancements I might receive. Because whatever took those 7 hours from me, whatever erased my memory of that time, it also gave me something in return. Something that has made me a better driver, a safer driver, a more ... aware driver. And sometimes, late at night on the loneliest stretches of highway, I wonder if that was the point all along. Story 11. The Forest That Moved. Linda Thompson has been driving the Pacific Northwest routes for 16 years, specializing in freight runs between California and Alaska. She knows the challenging terrain of the region better than most. From the mountain passes of the Cascades to the remote highways that wind through the temperate rainforests. But her experience on Highway 101 near the Olympic Peninsula left her questioning everything she thought she knew about the geography of the region. What she encountered that night suggests that sometimes the landscape itself might be more fluid than we assume. Here's Linda's story. I've been driving the Pacific Coast routes for 16 years, and I thought I knew every mile of Highway 101 between San Francisco and Alaska. I've memorized every curve, every grade, every landmark along the way. It's knowledge that comes with experience, the kind of intimate familiarity that can only be developed through thousands of miles and hundreds of trips. That's why what happened to me near the Olympic Peninsula is so disturbing. I encountered a stretch of forest that doesn't exist on any map, a road that led somewhere it shouldn't go, and landmarks that have no business being where I found them. I was hauling a load of electronics from Portland to Anchorage, running the night shift to avoid tourist traffic on the scenic coastal highway. It was late October, with the typical Pacific Northwest weather, steady rain, low visibility, and temperatures hovering just above freezing. I was about 50 miles north of Aberdeen, somewhere in the heart of the Olympic National Forest, when I first noticed that something was wrong. The trees were too tall. I know that sounds like a strange thing to notice, but I've driven this route hundreds of times. I know the typical height of the Douglas firs and western red cedars that line the highway. They're impressive trees, some of them over 200 feet tall. But what I was seeing that night defied explanation. The trees towering over the highway had to be at least 400 feet tall, maybe more. Massive, ancient-looking giants with trunks so wide that my headlights couldn't illuminate both edges at the same time. And they were growing in impossible formations. Instead of the random, natural growth patterns you'd expect in a forest, these trees were arranged in perfect geometric shapes, circles, triangles, straight lines that stretched for miles. Must be a tree farm, I muttered to myself, though I'd never seen a tree farm with trees that large, and I'd never noticed one on this stretch of highway before. But as I continued driving, more anomalies became apparent. The road itself was different, smoother than it should be, wider than I remembered, with guardrails that looked too new and reflectors that seemed to glow with their own internal light. And the mile markers were wrong. I've been tracking mile markers on this route for years as a way to gauge my progress and estimate arrival times. But the markers I was seeing didn't match my mental map of the highway. They were showing distances that didn't make sense, references to towns I'd never heard of. Mile marker 247, Cedar Grove, minus 15 miles. I'd never heard of a town called Cedar Grove on Highway 101, and according to my calculations, I should have been somewhere around mile marker 175. I tried to radio other drivers to get a position check, but my CB was picking up nothing but static. My GPS was showing an error message, claiming it couldn't acquire a satellite signal despite the clear sky above the forest canopy. That's when I saw the lights. Deep in the forest, maybe half a mile off the highway, points of light were moving between the massive trees, not the random flicker of campfires or the steady glow of buildings, but organized patterns of light that pulsed and shifted in coordination. The lights were blue-white, similar to high-intensity LEDs, but with a quality that was somehow more organic. They moved in formations that reminded me of bioluminescent sea creatures, flowing, undulating patterns that suggested intelligence. I slowed down to get a better look, and that's when I realized the lights were aware of me. As soon as I reduced speed, they began moving toward the highway, weaving between the enormous tree trunks with purpose and direction. "Time to go," I said out loud, and accelerated back to normal highway speed. But the lights kept pace with me, paralleling my route through the forest. Every time I checked my mirrors, I could see them moving through the trees, maintaining their distance, but clearly tracking my progress. This continued for what felt like hours, though my clock seemed to be malfunctioning. Sometimes it would advance normally, sometimes it would slow down, and occasionally it would skip forward by several minutes without explanation. Then I came around a curve and saw something that made me hit the brakes hard enough to activate my abs. A town, not a small highway settlement, but a full-sized town with streetlights, buildings, and traffic signals. It was nestled in a valley between the giant trees, looking like something out of a fantasy novel. The architecture was wrong for the Pacific Northwest, too ornate, too organic, with buildings that seemed to grow out of the landscape rather than being constructed on top of it. And everything was too clean, too perfect, like a movie set or a theme park version of a real town. The road sign at the town limits read, "Welcome to Cedar Grove, population 3,847, established 1847. But this was impossible. There was no town in this location. I'd driven this route hundreds of times, and this entire area was supposed to be protected national forest land. I pulled over at what appeared to be a gas station, though the pumps looked like nothing I'd ever seen before. Organic shapes that seemed to pulse with the same blue-white light I'd seen in the forest. A figure approached my truck. At first glance, it looked like a normal gas station attendant. Coveralls, baseball cap, friendly smile, but something about him was off. His movements were too fluid, too graceful, and his eyes reflected light like an animal's. "Fill her up," he asked, and his voice had an odd harmonic quality, like multiple people speaking in perfect unison. "Where am I?" I asked through my open window. "Cedar Grove," he replied, as if that explained everything. "This town isn't on my maps." "Lots of things aren't on maps," he said with that disturbing smile. "Doesn't mean they don't exist. I need to get back to Highway 101. You're on Highway 101. I looked around at the impossible town, the giant trees, the pulsing lights. "This isn't the Highway 101, I know. Highway goes lots of places," he said. "Depends on when you're traveling, how you're traveling, why you're traveling. What does that mean?" But he was already walking away, moving with that unnatural grace toward the building behind the gas pumps. I sat there for several minutes, trying to decide what to do. Every instinct told me to get out of this place as quickly as possible, but I wasn't sure how. If this really was Highway 101, then continuing north should eventually take me back to familiar territory. I put the truck in gear and drove through the town, past buildings that seemed to watch me with invisible eyes, past residents who moved like the gas station attendant, too fluid, too graceful, too perfect. On the far side of town, the highway continued north, winding between the massive trees. I accelerated, eager to put distance between myself and Cedar Grove. But when I checked my mirrors, the town was gone. Not fading into the distance like a normal town would, but completely absent, as if it had never existed at all. I drove for another hour through the impossible forest before the trees gradually returned to normal size, and the road began to match my memories of Highway 101. My GPS came back online, showing my position exactly where it should be according to my schedule. But I had lost 3 hours. According to my clock, my logbook, and my GPS, I had somehow traveled 70 miles in what felt like 20 minutes, and there was no record of the detour through Cedar Grove. When I reached my next scheduled stop in Port Angeles, I immediately asked about the town I'd encountered. "Cedar Grove," said the dispatcher. "Never heard of any town by that name around here." I checked with local authorities, tourism offices, and historical societies. Nobody had any record of a town called Cedar Grove in the Olympic National Forest. According to everyone I spoke with, the area I'd driven through was uninhabited wilderness and had been for decades. But I know what I saw. I know where I've been. There's a town in the forest that doesn't exist on any map, inhabited by people who aren't quite human, connected to our reality by a highway that sometimes goes places it's not supposed to go. And sometimes, late at night, when I'm driving the lonely stretches of Highway 101, I find myself watching for familiar landmarks, wondering if I'll see those impossibly tall trees again, wondering if the road will take me back to Cedar Grove. Part of me hopes it will, part of me hopes it won't, because some destinations aren't meant for travelers from our world. Some roads lead to places that exist in the spaces between what we think we know about reality. And once you've been to one of those places, once you've seen the impossible made manifest, you never quite look at the highway the same way again. Story 12. The Convoy of the Dead. Michael Chen, has been driving southwestern routes for 12 years, hauling freight between Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, and California. He's comfortable with the long, empty stretches of desert highway and the solitude that comes with driving through some of America's most sparsely populated regions. But his experience on Highway 285 between Roswell and Carlsbad, New Mexico, introduced him to a kind of solitude he'd never imagined, the company of drivers who shouldn't exist. Here's Michael's story. I've always been comfortable with solitude. The long desert highways, the endless horizons, the hours of driving with nothing but your own thoughts for company. It's one of the things I love about this job. Most drivers hate the empty routes, but I find them peaceful. At least, I used to. I was running a load of industrial equipment from Dallas to Phoenix, taking Highway 285 south through New Mexico. It's not the fastest route, but it's one of my favorites. A 2-lane highway that cuts through some of the most beautiful and desolate country in the Southwest. It was about 11 o'clock at night when I first saw the other trucks. I was about 30 miles north of Carlsbad when headlights appeared in my mirrors. Multiple sets of headlights, arranged in the precise formation of a convoy. Not unusual in itself, but something about this convoy felt wrong from the beginning. The trucks were too old. Even in the darkness, I could make out the silhouettes of vehicles that hadn't been manufactured in decades. Cab-over-engine designs from the 70s, boxy trailers with outdated marker lights, the kind of rigs you might see in a trucking museum, but not on the modern highway. And they were moving too slowly. I was doing about 65, but the convoy was gaining on me at maybe 40 miles per hour. That should have meant I was pulling away from them, but somehow the distance between us was closing. I tried raising them on the CB, scanning through channels 17, 19, and 21. Breaker for the northbound convoy on 285, I called. What's your 20 and destination? Static. Then a voice that sounded like it was coming from very far away. Northbound convoy, running dark, maintaining radio silence, running dark. I could clearly see their headlights. Copy that, I replied. Just wondering about your equipment. Looks like some classic rigs you've got there. Long pause, then. Been running these roads longer than you've been alive, son. There was something about the voice that made my skin crawl. It had a hollow quality, like an echo of an echo, and underneath the words I could hear what sounded like wind blowing through empty spaces. The convoy continued to close the distance between us, and as they got closer, more details became visible. The trucks were not just old, they were damaged. Dented fenders, cracked windshields, rust stains that looked black in the darkness. And the drivers. I couldn't see them clearly, but what I could see made no sense. Silhouettes behind the windshields that didn't move, didn't shift position, didn't display any of the small, unconscious movements that living people make. They looked like mannequins or corpses. This is getting weird, I muttered to myself, and decided to pull over and let the convoy pass. I found a wide spot on the shoulder and activated my hazard lights. The convoy approached steadily, their ancient engines rumbling with a sound that was somehow too deep, too resonant for diesel motors. The first truck passed me, and I got a clear look at the driver. He was wearing a cowboy hat and a denim jacket that looked like it had been popular in the 1970s. His hands were positioned on the steering wheel. His eyes were facing forward, but he wasn't moving, not breathing, not blinking, not making any of the small adjustments that active driving requires. He was driving, but he wasn't alive. The second truck passed, then the third, then the fourth. Each driver was the same, frozen in position, staring straight ahead, hands locked on the steering wheel like they'd been welded there. And each truck was clearly from a different era. 70s Peterbilts, 80s Kenworths, 90s Freightliners, a rolling museum of trucking history, all of it decades out of date, all of it driven by corpses. As the last truck in the convoy passed me, the driver turned his head and looked directly at me. His face was gray, desiccated, with empty eye sockets that somehow still conveyed awareness. His mouth opened as if he was trying to speak, but no sound came out. Then he was gone, and the convoy continued north on Highway 285, their taillights gradually disappearing into the darkness. I sat on the shoulder for 20 minutes, trying to process what I'd just witnessed. Every rational part of my mind was screaming that this was impossible, that I must have been hallucinating or dreaming. But I was wide awake, alert, and completely sober. I knew the difference between reality and imagination. Finally, I got back on the road and continued south toward Carlsbad. But I couldn't stop thinking about what I'd seen. Couldn't shake the image of those dead drivers piloting their ghost trucks through the New Mexico night. When I reached Carlsbad, I stopped at the first truck stop I found and asked around to see if anyone else had encountered the convoy. Most drivers looked at me like I was crazy, but one old-timer, a guy named Earl, who'd been running southwestern routes for 40 years, pulled me aside. "You saw them," he said quietly. It wasn't a question. Saw who? The night convoy, the dead drivers. I felt a chill run down my spine. "You've seen them too?" He nodded grimly. "First time was about 20 years ago, same stretch of road. Been seeing them off and on ever since." "What are they?" "Drivers who died on the highway," he said. "Accidents, heart attacks, whatever. But they can't let go of the road. So they keep driving, night after night, trying to complete runs that will never end. That's impossible." "Is it? You tell me what else could explain a convoy of trucks from the 70s and 80s, driven by corpses, traveling a highway at midnight." I couldn't answer that. I still can't. Earl told me more about the phenomenon. According to him, the convoy appears several times a year on various highways throughout the Southwest, always at night, always featuring trucks and drivers from different eras, always heading north toward some unknown destination. "Some people think they're trying to get home," he said, "back to wherever they came from before they died. Others think they're carrying loads that were never delivered, trying to complete their final runs. Have you ever tried to follow them?" His face went pale once, about 10 years ago. Followed them for maybe 50 miles before they turned off onto a side road that didn't exist. "What do you mean, didn't exist?" "I mean, when I tried to take the same turn, there was nothing there, just empty desert. But I could see their taillights continuing down a road that wasn't there." I've thought about Earl's words countless times over the past 6 months. I've researched traffic fatalities on New Mexico highways, looking for patterns that might explain what I witnessed. What I found was disturbing. Over the past 50 years, dozens of truckers have died on Highway 285 and the surrounding routes, heart attacks, accidents, mechanical failures that led to fatal crashes. Many of them were never found for days or weeks, their bodies discovered only after someone noticed their absence. Part of me hopes I never will, but part of me is curious about those drivers, about what keeps them bound to the highway, about where they're trying to go. Because if Earl is right, if those are the spirits of truckers who died on the road, then they represent something tragic and beautiful at the same time. Men and women who loved driving so much that even death couldn't separate them from the highway. Maybe they're not trying to get home. Maybe they're not trying to complete final deliveries. Maybe they're just trying to keep driving, to maintain their connection to the road that defined their lives. Maybe the highway itself has become their home, their eternal route, their final destination. And maybe, sometimes, they encounter living drivers like me to remind us that the road never truly lets go of those who belong to it. The thought should be comforting, but it's not, because it raises the question of what happens to all of us who spend our lives on the highway when our time comes to join that eternal convoy that runs through the desert darkness, carrying loads that will never be delivered to destinations that exist only in memory. I don't know. I hope I never find out. But sometimes, late at night, on the loneliest stretches of Southwestern Highway, I find myself scanning my mirrors, looking for headlights that belong to trucks from another era. And sometimes, just sometimes, I think I see them in the distance. That convoy of the dead, still running their eternal route through the New Mexico night. Story 13. The passenger who wasn't there, Jennifer Walsh, has been driving coastal routes for 8 years, specializing in time-sensitive deliveries between Los Angeles and Seattle. She's experienced with the challenging conditions that coastal driving presents: fog, rain, narrow roads carved into cliffsides, and the constant presence of the Pacific Ocean. But her experience on Highway 1 near Big Sur introduced her to a passenger she never picked up, someone who shouldn't have been in her truck, but somehow managed to save her life. Here's Jennifer's story. I've been driving the Pacific Coast Highway for 8 years, and I thought I knew every hazard, every challenge, every trick that route could throw at me. The fog that rolls in without warning, the narrow roads with no guardrails, the tourists who stop suddenly to take pictures. I dealt with it all, running against a tight deadline that required night driving through some of the most dangerous coastal terrain in California. The weather was typical for the area, dense fog rolling in off the Pacific, reducing visibility to maybe 50 feet. And in conditions like this, one mistake could be fatal. I was about 20 miles south of Monterey when I first became aware that I wasn't alone in the cab. It started as just a feeling, that sensation you get when someone is watching you, even when you know you're by yourself. I chalked it up to nerves and the stress of driving in dangerous conditions. But then I heard breathing, quiet, steady, coming from the passenger seat. I glanced over, and there was nothing there, just an empty seat, and the glow of my dashboard lights reflecting off the fog outside. Getting paranoid, I muttered to myself, and focused on the road ahead. But the breathing continued, in, out, a rhythm that was slightly different from my own, creating an unsettling counterpoint to my own respiratory pattern. Then I heard a voice, "Slow down." As I did, my headlights caught something that made my heart stop. A massive tree had fallen across the highway, completely blocking both lanes. If I hadn't slowed down when the voice told me to, I would have hit it at full speed. I stopped the truck about 20 feet from the fallen tree and sat there for a moment, hands shaking on the steering wheel. I turned to look directly at the passenger seat, and for just a moment, I thought I saw a shimmer in the air, like heat waves rising from hot asphalt, but more defined, more purposeful. "Who are you?" I asked. "Someone who knows this road. Are you dead?" A pause. Then, "Does it matter?" I suppose it didn't. Dead or alive, real or imaginary, this presence had just saved my life. "This is going to take a while," I said to my invisible passenger. I've got time. Over the next 2 hours, while we waited for the highway to reopen, I found myself talking to this presence as if he were a real person sitting next to me. And he talked back, sharing stories about Highway 1, about the hazards and beauties of coastal driving, about accidents he'd witnessed and disasters he'd helped prevent. He spoke with the knowledge of someone who'd spent decades on this highway, someone who knew every curve and grade intimately. "What's your name?" I asked eventually. "Carl Stevens. How long have you been helping drivers on this road?" "Since 1987, that's when I went over the edge. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the coastal fog. You had an accident. Fog just like this. Was running behind schedule, pushing too hard, took a curve too fast, and went right through the guardrail. Dropped 300 feet into the rocks. I'm sorry, don't be. I was an idiot, driving reckless, putting other people at risk. This is my chance to make up for it by helping other drivers, by trying to prevent them from making the same mistakes I did." The road crew finally arrived around 3 in the morning, and within an hour they had the tree cleared and traffic moving again. As I put the truck in gear and prepared to continue south, I felt the presence beginning to fade. "Thank you, Carl," I said. "Drive safe, Jennifer. How do you know my name?" But there was no answer. The presence was gone, leaving only the normal sounds of my truck and the fog-muffled ocean beyond the cliffs. On March 15th, 1987, during a night run in heavy fog, his truck went off Highway 1, near the same spot where I'd encountered the fallen tree. His body was never recovered. The truck was found at the bottom of a 300-foot cliff, completely destroyed, but Carl Stevens was never found. I contacted other drivers who regularly run Highway 1, asking if anyone had experienced anything similar. What I discovered was both comforting and unsettling, helped them navigate dangerous conditions, or simply provided companionship during long, lonely drives. Always a man's voice, always knowledgeable about the road, always disappearing when the immediate danger had passed. Some drivers called him the ghost of Highway 1. Others referred to him as the guardian. "He saved my life 3 years ago," one driver told me. "Warned me about a washout that would have taken me right over the cliff. I never saw him, but I heard his voice clear as day." "Same thing happened to me," said another. "Truck broke down in the fog, and I was getting ready to walk for help. Voice told me to stay with the vehicle, that help was coming. Sure enough, Highway Patrol found me an hour later. For over 30 years, he's been watching over Highway 1, helping drivers navigate its dangers, preventing accidents that might have echoed his own tragedy. I've driven Highway 1 dozens of times since that night, and I've never encountered Carl again. But I'm always aware that he might be there, watching from the passenger seat, ready to help if danger threatens. Someone who's paid the ultimate price for its dangers is still out there looking after the rest of us. Carl Stevens made a mistake 37 years ago, and it cost him his life. But his death wasn't the end of his story. It was the beginning of a new kind of service, a different way of looking after his fellow drivers. In life, he was just another trucker running the coastal route. In death, he's become something more, a guardian spirit of Highway 1, a protector of those who dare to challenge one of America's most dangerous roads. And sometimes, when the fog rolls in thick off the Pacific and visibility drops to almost nothing, I find myself talking to the empty passenger seat, sharing the road with a presence that died decades ago but refuses to abandon his post. Thank you, Carl. I say to the fog and the darkness. And sometimes, just sometimes, I think I hear a voice reply, "Drive safe, Jennifer." He's experienced with extreme weather conditions, mechanical failures, in sub-zero temperatures, and the unique challenges of driving through some of North America's most unforgiving wilderness. But his experience during a whiteout near Fairbanks tested not just his driving skills, but his understanding of what's possible when human endurance reaches its limits. Here's Robert's story. Ice storms that turn highways into skating rinks. I dealt with it all, but the whiteout that hit me near Fairbanks last winter was something beyond anything I'd ever experienced. And what happened during that storm? Well, it challenges everything I thought I knew about survival and the human spirit. I was hauling a load of medical supplies and food to a village about 200 miles north of Fairbanks, running against a deadline that couldn't be missed. The village clinic needed the medical supplies for an outbreak of flu that was threatening the entire community. The weather forecast had called for light snow, nothing that would interfere with the run. But as anyone who's driven in Alaska knows, weather forecasts can change in minutes, and storms can appear out of nowhere with little warning. I was about 100 miles out of Fairbanks when the wind started picking up. Within 20 minutes, what had been a light snowfall became a full-scale blizzard. Visibility dropped from miles to yards to almost nothing. I slowed to a crawl, using my GPS and the reflective markers along the roadside to maintain course. But the storm kept intensifying, and soon I couldn't see beyond my front bumper. Then my GPS died. Not just the display, the entire unit went dead, as if something had drained all the power out of it. My backup GPS unit failed at the same time, along with my CB radio and my cell phone. I was driving blind through a whiteout with no navigation equipment and no way to call for help. I should have stopped immediately, should have pulled over and waited for the storm to pass. But I knew that people were depending on the supplies I was carrying, and I was worried that stopping on the highway might be more dangerous than continuing. So I kept driving, following what I hoped was the road. 2 dim red dots in my windshield, barely visible through the swirling snow. At first, I thought they might be the taillights of another vehicle, but they were too small, too steady, and they seemed to be floating about 10 feet above the ground. The lights began to move, slowly at first, then with more purpose. They stayed ahead of me, always visible despite the blinding snow, maintaining a consistent distance of maybe 50 feet. I followed them. I had no choice. They were the only reference points I had in the white chaos surrounding my truck, and something about their movement suggested intelligence, purpose, as if they were deliberately leading me somewhere. For the next 3 hours, those mysterious lights guided me through the worst whiteout I'd ever experienced. They led me around obstacles I couldn't see, warned me of dangerous curves by moving in specific patterns, and somehow kept me on the road when I should have been hopelessly lost. During that time, my truck's heater began to fail. The temperature in the cab dropped below freezing, and ice began forming on the inside of my windshield. My hands were so cold I could barely grip the steering wheel, and I could feel hypothermia beginning to set in. That's when I heard the voice. It came through my dead CB radio, clear and strong, despite the fact that the unit had no power. "Keep your eyes on the lights," the voice said. "Don't stop moving. The village is only 20 miles ahead." "Who is this?" I asked, not even bothering to key the microphone since the radio was dead. "Someone who knows this road. How are you transmitting?" "My radio isn't working." "Your radio is fine. You're just listening on a different frequency. The voice continued to guide me, providing information about road conditions ahead, warning me about drifts and ice patches, encouraging me to keep going when exhaustion and cold made me want to give up. "What's your name?" I asked during one of our conversations. "Tom Brennan. I used to run this route. Used to. Got caught in a storm like this 5 years ago. Truck broke down about 30 miles from the village. Tried to walk for help. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. What happened? Didn't make it. They found my body 3 days later, about 10 miles from the truck. I was talking to a dead man who was somehow guiding me through a blizzard, keeping me alive when I should have been hopelessly lost." "Tom," I said, Are you a ghost? Does it matter? You need help. I can provide it. That's all that counts right now." The lights continued to lead me through the storm, and Tom's voice continued to provide guidance and encouragement. He told me about the village I was heading to, about the people who were waiting for the supplies I was carrying, about the importance of completing the run. "They're good people," he said. "They helped search for me when I went missing. Didn't give up for days, even when the authorities said it was hopeless. I owe them." "Is that why you're helping me?" "Partly, but also because I understand what it's like to be lost in a storm like this. I know how easy it is to give up, to just stop fighting and let the cold take you. But you didn't give up." "No, I didn't. I kept going until I couldn't go anymore. And now I help other drivers do the same." As we got closer to the village, the storm began to ease slightly. The lights ahead of me became brighter, more defined, and I could see that they were leading me toward a cluster of buildings, barely visible through the snow. "That's it," Tom's voice said through the dead radio. "You made it. What about you? Are you coming with me? My job here is done." "But Robert?" "Yeah, tell them Tom Brennan helped you get here. Tell them I'm still looking after drivers on this route. I will, and be careful on the way back. This storm isn't over yet." The lights disappeared as I pulled into the village, and Tom's voice faded from the radio. I delivered the supplies to grateful villagers who told me they'd been watching for my truck for hours, worried that I'd been caught in the storm. I told them about Tom Brennan, about how his voice had guided me through the whiteout. The village elders nodded solemnly. "Tom was a good man," one of them said. "He died trying to help our community, and we've always believed his spirit stayed with us. You've encountered him before, not directly, but other drivers have reported hearing his voice during storms, seeing lights that led them to safety. Tom's been watching over this route for years." I stayed in the village until the storm passed, then made the return trip to Fairbanks without incident. But I've never forgotten the experience of being guided through that whiteout by a man who died 5 years ago. Tom Brennan was a driver who made the ultimate sacrifice, trying to help a remote community. His death should have been the end of his story, but instead it became the beginning of a new kind of service. He's become the guardian spirit of that lonely highway, watching over drivers who brave the Alaskan wilderness to bring supplies to communities that depend on our dedication. I've made that run dozens of times since that night, and I've never encountered Tom again. But I'm always aware that he might be there, ready to help if the weather turns dangerous. And sometimes, when the wind is howling and the snow is flying, I find myself talking to my dead CB radio, sharing the loneliness of the road with a presence that died years ago but refuses to abandon his post. "Thank you, Tom," I say to the Arctic darkness, and sometimes, Just sometimes, I think I hear a voice reply, "Drive safe, Robert. The village is counting on you." Story 15, The Last Mile. James Mitchell has been driving long haul for 35 years, covering every state in the continental United States multiple times. He's scheduled to retire next month, ending a career that has defined his adult life and taken him over 3 million miles across America's highways. But his recent experience on Interstate 70 in Kansas has made him reconsider everything he thought he knew about endings, about retirement, and about what happens to drivers who have truly given their lives to the road. This is James's story, and perhaps, in some way, it's all of our stories. 35 years, 3 million miles. That's what my logbooks show when I add it all up. 35 years of sunrises seen through a windshield, of truck stops and way stations, of loading docks and delivery schedules. 35 years of calling the highway home. I'm supposed to retire next month. Companies giving me a nice ceremony, a gold watch, a pension that'll let me buy a little place somewhere and settle down. Everyone says I've earned it, that it's time to rest, time to enjoy the fruits of my labor. But what happened to me on I-70 in Kansas last week has me wondering if retirement is really possible for someone like me. If you can ever truly leave the road when the road has become such a fundamental part of who you are. I was running my next to last load, electronics from Kansas City to Denver, when I encountered something that changed my perspective on everything. It was about 2 in the morning, and I was somewhere in the middle of Kansas. That long, flat stretch where you can see for miles in every direction during the day. But at night, it's just endless darkness, broken by the occasional farmhouse light. I was monitoring Channel 19 on my CB, listening to the usual late-night chatter from other drivers, when I started hearing voices I recognized, not just familiar voices, voices of drivers I'd known over the years, drivers who'd shared the road with me, who'd become friends through countless conversations over the radio. The problem was, most of these drivers were dead. There was Billy Patterson, who'd had a heart attack at a truck stop in Oklahoma 3 years ago. Randy Morrison, who'd been killed in an accident on I-95 in Georgia. Sarah Chen, who died of cancer last year after fighting it for months while still trying to drive. All of them talking on the CB like they were still out there, still running their routes, still part of the community of drivers that had sustained us all for so many years. "Evening, James," came Billy's familiar voice. "How's the road treating you tonight?" I grabbed my microphone, hands shaking. "Billy, is that really you?" "Course it's me. Who else would it be?" "But Billy, you died 3 years ago." Laughter on the radio. Not just from Billy, but from multiple voices, all of them drivers I'd known, all of them supposedly dead. "Death's just another kind of dispatch," Billy said. "Different destination, same job." "What do you mean?" "Once you've given your life to the road, James, the road doesn't let you go. We're all still here, still driving, still running our routes. Where? Same highways, same truck stops, same destinations, just on a different frequency." More voices joined the conversation. Randy Morrison describing a load he was hauling to Seattle. Sarah Chen talking about the beautiful sunrise she'd seen over the Rockies. Drivers I'd known for decades, all of them continuing their conversations as if death had been nothing more than a brief interruption. "Why can I hear you?" I asked. "Because you're almost ready," said a new voice, one I recognized but couldn't place immediately, "to join us, to stop pretending that retirement means leaving the road. The voice was familiar, but older, more authoritative than the others. Finally, I recognized it. Dad, my father, had been a trucker, too, back in the days when the industry was different, when drivers were more independent, more connected to their rigs and their roots. He'd died 15 years ago, but his voice on the radio was unmistakable. "Hello, son. Dad, what's happening? What is this?" This is what happens to drivers who've truly given their lives to the highway. We don't retire, James. We just ... transition. I don't understand. You've been out here for 35 years. The road is in your blood, in your bones, in your soul. You think you can just walk away from all of that, buy a house, tend a garden, pretend that this life never happened. I thought about the retirement party being planned for me, about the little house I'd been looking at in Florida, about the quiet life I was supposed to want after decades on the road. But I'm tired, Dad. I'm 62 years old, and my body's worn out from all these years of driving. Your body's tired, he agreed, but your spirit isn't. Your spirit belongs to the highway, son. Always has, always will. The conversation continued for the next hour, with dozens of drivers I'd known over the years sharing their experiences of what came after. They told me about routes that existed beyond the physical highway, about loads that carried meaning rather than cargo, about destinations that could only be reached by those who truly understood what it meant to be a driver. "The road has many levels," explained Sarah Chen. "The physical highways that the living use are just the first level. There are others, deeper levels, for those of us who've earned the right to access them." "What kind of loads do you haul?" I asked. "Hope," said Billy Patterson. "We haul hope to places where it's needed most." "Dreams," added Randy Morrison. "Dreams that need to be delivered to the people who are ready to receive them." "Sometimes we haul souls," said my father. "New drivers who are just discovering their calling, experienced drivers who need guidance, souls who are transitioning from one level of existence to another. And sometimes," said a voice I didn't recognize, "we haul stories, stories that need to be preserved, shared, remembered." "What happens to my truck?" I asked. "My logbooks, my memories, my life on the physical highway." "They become part of your equipment for the next level," my father explained. "Your experiences, your knowledge, your connections to other drivers, all of that becomes cargo for your new routes." As the night wore on, I found myself less frightened and more curious about what these voices were describing. The idea of continuing to drive, of staying connected to the highway community that had been my family for 35 years, was actually appealing. How do I make the transition?" I asked. "You don't choose it," my father said. "It chooses you. When you're ready, when your time on the physical highway is complete, the transition happens naturally." "What about my retirement party, my pension, the house in Florida?" "Those are for people who are truly leaving their old lives behind," said Sarah Chen. "But some of us are just changing vehicles, moving to a different fleet." As dawn began to break over the Kansas prairie, the voices gradually faded from my CB radio. But before they disappeared completely, my father's voice came through one last time. "Don't be afraid of the transition, son. The road takes care of its own. When your time comes, we'll be here to show you the new routes." "How will I know when it's time?" "You'll know. The highway will tell you." The radio went silent, leaving only the normal morning chatter of living drivers beginning their daily runs. I completed my delivery to Denver and returned to Kansas City. but I couldn't stop thinking about what I'd experienced. Was it real, or just the product of an aging mind trying to cope with the end of a career? I don't know. I may never know. But as I approach my official retirement date, I find myself less excited about the house in Florida and more aware of the pull I still feel toward the highway. The road has been my life for 35 years. My office, my home, my church, my community. Maybe some people can walk away from that. Maybe some drivers can truly retire, can disconnect from the highway and find satisfaction in a different kind of life. But maybe others, drivers like me, like my father, like all the voices I heard that night, are too connected to the road to ever really leave it. Maybe for us, retirement isn't about ending our relationship with the highway. Maybe it's about deepening it, about accessing levels of the road that we never knew existed. I have one more load to haul before my official retirement. A simple run from Kansas City to Chicago, the same route I've driven hundreds of times over the years. But I find myself wondering if it will really be my last load, or just my last load on this level of the highway. Because if those voices were real, if there are deeper levels of the road waiting for drivers who've truly given their lives to the highway, then maybe my retirement party next month isn't an ending at all. Maybe it's just another dispatch, another load, another opportunity to serve the road that has given meaning to my life. And if that's the case, then I'm ready to transition, ready to discover what lies beyond the physical highways, ready to join the community of drivers who never truly retire. The road has been good to me for 35 years. If it's willing to keep me for another 35, I'm ready to keep driving. After all, as Billy Patterson said, death is just another kind of dispatch, different destination, same job. And for drivers like us, the job never really ends. It just moves to a different level, a different frequency, a different kind of highway that stretches beyond the horizon into places that maps can't show and GPS can't find. Places that can only be reached by those who understand that driving isn't just what we do, it's who we are. Story 16. Miguel Santos accepted the expedited load assignment without asking many questions. As the premium pay rate suggested either urgent delivery requirements or cargo that warranted special handling procedures. The pickup was scheduled at a biotechnology facility outside Houston, with delivery to a research laboratory in Denver within 36 hours. Miguel's Volvo tractor and climate-controlled trailer were well suited for sensitive cargo, and he held all necessary endorsements for transporting materials that required special certification and handling protocols according to Department of Transportation regulations. The loading process at the Houston facility proceeded with unusual attention to security and documentation, with multiple personnel verifying serial numbers, temperatures, and container integrity before authorizing the cargo to be loaded into Miguel's trailer. The freight consisted of sealed laboratory containers arranged in precise configurations within temperature-controlled storage units that looked more sophisticated than standard pharmaceutical shipping equipment. Each container bore identification codes rather than descriptive labels, providing no indication of the actual contents or their intended use. Miguel's trailer was equipped with advanced monitoring systems that tracked not only temperature and humidity, but also vibration levels, atmospheric pressure, and other environmental factors that could affect sensitive biological or chemical materials during transport. The cargo required constant temperature maintenance at exactly 4 degrees Celsius, with alarm systems that would alert both Miguel and his dispatcher. If conditions deviated from specified parameters, everything about the load suggested materials of considerable value and sensitivity. The first unusual occurrence happened approximately 2 hours into the journey. As Miguel was traveling north on Interstate 45 toward Dallas, he began hearing sounds from his trailer that couldn't be explained by normal road vibration, cargo settling, or the operation of the refrigeration equipment. The sounds resembled whispered conversations, as if multiple people were engaged in quiet discussions inside the climate-controlled cargo compartment. Miguel pulled over to inspect his load, but found all security seals intact and monitoring systems showing normal parameters. Miguel's inspection of the trailer exterior revealed no obvious sources for the sounds he was hearing, and the climate control systems were operating normally according to their digital displays. However, when Miguel placed his ear against the trailer wall, he could clearly distinguish what sounded like multiple voices engaged in complex discussions using technical terminology that seemed related to scientific research and experimental procedures. The conversations were too quiet to understand completely, but the tone suggested urgency and concern about their current situation. The whispered voices continued as Miguel resumed his journey toward Denver, sometimes growing more animated during specific driving conditions, such as acceleration, braking, or turns in the highway. The conversations seemed to be responding to the truck's motion, with the voices expressing awareness of their transportation and discussing their concerns about the delivery destination. Miguel began to suspect that his cargo was somehow more active and aware than the sealed laboratory containers appeared to suggest. Miguel's CB radio began picking up transmissions that seemed connected to his cargo, though the conversations used highly technical language that was difficult to understand without specialized scientific knowledge. The voices discussed research protocols, experimental results, and safety procedures using terminology that suggested advanced biotechnology or genetic engineering projects. The transmissions had an urgency that contrasted with the routine nature of most commercial radio communications. As night fell and Miguel continued north through Oklahoma, the whispered voices from his trailer became more distinct and comprehensible. The conversations revealed that his cargo consisted of experimental subjects, or specimens that possessed some level of consciousness and awareness of their situation. They discussed their concerns about the research facility in Denver, expressing fears about procedures that awaited them at their destination, and requesting help from anyone who might be listening to their communications. Miguel's truck began experiencing subtle performance changes that seemed somehow connected to the conscious cargo in his trailer. The vehicle's electronic systems showed fluctuations in power consumption and operational parameters that corresponded to the intensity of the whispered conversations. His engine performed more efficiently when the cargo voices were calm and relaxed, but required more power when the conversations became agitated or distressed, as if the emotional state of his cargo was affecting his truck's mechanical operation. The climate control systems in Miguel's trailer began operating in patterns that didn't correspond to external weather conditions or programmed temperature requirements, adjusting humidity and airflow in ways that seemed designed to provide comfort to conscious beings, rather than simply maintaining optimal storage conditions for laboratory materials. The refrigeration unit was apparently responding to the needs and preferences of aware cargo rather than following standard environmental control protocols. Miguel's electronic logging device began recording conversations and communications that seemed to originate from his cargo, documenting discussions about research procedures, experimental protocols, and concerns about their treatment and destination. The system was somehow detecting and logging the conscious thoughts and communications of whatever was being transported in his trailer, creating records of interactions between experimental subjects that were supposed to be inanimate laboratory materials. As Miguel approached the Colorado state line, the whispered voices from his cargo began expressing gratitude for his careful driving and professional handling of their transport, acknowledging his efforts to minimize stress and discomfort during their journey. They discussed Miguel himself with appreciation and concern, recognizing that he was unaware of their true nature and that his involvement in their transport might create ethical complications for someone who was simply performing his professional duties as a commercial driver. The cargo began providing Miguel with information about route conditions, traffic patterns, and weather situations that weren't available through normal communication channels, as if the conscious beings in his trailer had access to information sources beyond conventional trucking industry resources. They offered warnings about construction zones, suggested optimal fuel stops, and provided guidance that improved his delivery time and fuel efficiency throughout the journey to Denver. Miguel's truck began receiving additional load assignments that seemed connected to his current cargo, with dispatchers apparently believing that his successful transport of conscious experimental subjects qualified him for similar sensitive shipments. The communications suggested that there was a network of research facilities and biotechnology companies that required specialized transportation services for materials that possessed awareness and intelligence beyond normal laboratory specimens. As Miguel approached the Denver delivery facility, the whispered voices from his cargo began expressing their final thoughts and concerns about their destination, discussing research procedures and experimental protocols that awaited them at the laboratory. They thanked Miguel for his professional service and careful handling during their transport, acknowledging that he had treated them with dignity and respect despite being unaware of their conscious nature. The voices gradually became quieter as the truck approached the delivery location. Miguel realized that his career as a commercial driver had somehow led him into transportation of conscious beings rather than simple laboratory materials, and that his cargo's awareness and intelligence had created an ethical situation that went far beyond normal freight delivery responsibilities. The whispered voices had revealed that the biotechnology industry was developing and transporting forms of life that possessed consciousness and emotional responses, requiring drivers who could handle such shipments with appropriate sensitivity and professional discretion. Story 17. Catherine Williams first noticed the unusual cloud formation in her side mirror as she was traveling east on Interstate 70 through Kansas, hauling a load of wind turbine components from Colorado to an installation site in Missouri. The weather system appeared to be a localized storm front that was moving in the same direction and at approximately the same speed as her truck, maintaining a consistent distance of perhaps 2 or 3 miles behind her trailer. Catherine had 22 years of experience driving through various weather conditions across the Midwest, and she'd never observed meteorological phenomena that seemed to track individual vehicles with such precision. The storm system was distinctive and well-defined, featuring dark clouds with internal lightning that created an almost continuous light show against the afternoon sky. The weather formation appeared to be completely isolated from other atmospheric conditions in the area, existing as a singular entity that moved independently of regional weather patterns and wind currents. Other drivers on the highway were experiencing normal autumn conditions, while Catherine's truck seemed to be accompanied by its own personal storm system. Catherine's CB radio began picking up weather reports that seemed to be specifically focused on the storm system that was following her truck, with meteorologists discussing the unusual characteristics of a weather formation that was tracking a single commercial vehicle across multiple states. The reports described atmospheric conditions that didn't match any known weather patterns, suggesting that the storm was somehow artificial or controlled rather than a natural meteorological event. As Catherine continued eastward through Kansas, the storm system maintained its relative position behind her truck, despite variations in her speed and route changes. When she accelerated to pass slower traffic, the weather formation accelerated accordingly. When she reduced speed for construction zones, the storm slowed to match her velocity. The meteorological phenomenon seemed to be connected to her vehicle through some invisible force that allowed it to mirror her driving patterns with perfect synchronization. Catherine's truck began experiencing effects from the storm system despite its distance, with electronic equipment showing interference patterns that corresponded to the lightning activity in the trailing weather formation. Her radio reception fluctuated with the intensity of the electrical activity, and her GPS system occasionally lost signal when the storm's internal lightning reached peak intensity. The weather was somehow affecting her truck's systems across a greater distance than should have been meteorologically possible. The atmospheric conditions around Catherine's truck began changing in ways that reflected the characteristics of the following storm, with temperature and humidity levels that matched the weather system rather than the normal conditions other vehicles were experiencing. Her cab's climate control system worked harder to maintain comfortable conditions, as if the truck was surrounded by the storm's environment, despite the clear separation indicated by her mirrors. Catherine pulled over at a truck stop to observe the storm system more closely and perhaps wait for it to pass or change direction. However, when her truck came to a complete stop, the weather formation also became stationary, hovering at the same relative distance and maintaining its electrical activity without dissipating or moving away. The storm seemed to be anchored to Catherine's vehicle, unable or unwilling to continue its journey without her truck's movement to guide its progress. Other drivers at the truck stop confirmed that the storm system was indeed following Catherine's truck specifically, having observed the unusual weather formation tracking her vehicle across multiple miles of highway. Several truckers mentioned similar experiences with weather systems that seemed to be connected to individual trucks or drivers, suggesting that the phenomenon was entirely unique but represented a category of meteorological events that affected certain vehicles under specific conditions. Catherine's electronic logging device began recording weather data that did correspond to the conditions being experienced by other vehicles in the same geographic area, showing temperature, pressure, and humidity readings that matched the storm system rather than the normal atmospheric conditions. The device seemed to be monitoring the microclimate that surrounded her truck, creating weather records that were specific to her vehicle rather than reflecting regional meteorological patterns. As Catherine resumed her journey toward Missouri, the storm system immediately began following her truck again, maintaining its precise distance and speed coordination with renewed consistency. The weather formation seemed to have used her rest stop as an opportunity to organize itself more completely, emerging from the stationary period with enhanced electrical activity and more defined cloud structures that suggested increased power and organization. Catherine's fuel consumption began increasing in patterns that seemed connected to the storm system's intensity. With her engine working harder when the trailing weather formation showed increased electrical activity, the truck seemed to be fighting atmospheric conditions that were more challenging than the clear skies that other vehicles were experiencing, as if the storm was creating drag or resistance that affected only her vehicle while leaving other traffic unaffected. The storm began providing Catherine with advanced warning about weather conditions ahead of her route, with lightning patterns and cloud movements that seemed to predict atmospheric changes that she would encounter hours later. The trailing weather system appeared to have access to meteorological information that extended far beyond normal forecasting capabilities, offering guidance about driving conditions that proved remarkably accurate as Catherine continued her journey eastward. Catherine's truck began receiving weather-related communications through her CB radio, with voices that seemed to originate from within the storm system itself. The transmissions discussed atmospheric conditions, electrical activity, and weather patterns, using terminology that suggested the storm possessed some form of intelligence or awareness of its own behavior and effects. The weather formation was apparently capable of communication and seemed interested in maintaining a cooperative relationship with Catherine during their shared journey. As Catherine approached the Missouri state line, she realized that the storm system had become a permanent companion that would continue following her truck indefinitely, providing both challenges and benefits to her driving career. The weather formation seemed to be offering protection from other atmospheric hazards, while creating its own unique set of driving conditions that would require adjustment of her normal procedures and expectations. Catherine understood that her truck had somehow creating a unique partnership between driver and meteorological phenomenon that would fundamentally change her experience as a commercial transportation professional. The storm system had chosen her truck as its anchor point in the physical world, creating a relationship that existed beyond normal understanding of weather, driving, and the interaction between atmospheric conditions and highway transportation.